Civilizations, Millennia and Microcosm. We are going through chapter 4, Ancient Civilizations, and I wrote section 5, but I meant to write section F. Section F, Mythos and Logos. I'm gonna typos, right? And we're going to do, unlike the last several weeks since my return, we're going to do a deep dive into the text. We're going to do a very text-driven approach and see if we can get through some of the core points he's making here.
I was suggesting stepping back and trying to figure out why he's got that whole set of headings. How do they relate?
I'd certainly be willing to give that a shot after my return. You know, I'm on a schedule where I'm 2 weeks on and 1 week off.
Yes.
So next week is my wife's chemotherapy week, and that means we'll be off next week, and I'll be back the week after that. But yeah, Stephen, I'd be perfectly happy to do why did he do the top level headings the way that he did when we return? What is the point of that? I almost did that today, but then I prepped actually going to the text instead. So why don't we dive into the text, and then we'll and then next time we can take a step back and look at the organization. So I'm kicking us in with what is 1, 2, 3, 4, paragraph 4 of section F. And before this point, he's been talking a bit about, about generalities. And 2 of the paragraphs he spent talking about this kind of structure of the Greek cosmology and mythology itself. The first paragraph was more just trying to orient. But this is the first paragraph in this section where he really dives into the business that he means to accomplish in this section. And the business he means to accomplish is to directly address the problem we have, which is that we can't understand what myths mean to the Greeks because we have myth defined as a lie. Urban myths, myth of the self-made man, the myths are mistakes to a modern. Myths are errors. And they might be useful mistakes. You might promulgate them on purpose, for entertainment or to make money or to fool people, but they're lies at their root. They're stories that are lies is the structure. If you watch Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson's respective Cosmos series, they tackle the question of what they think a myth is, and this is from a modernist perspective. They think a myth is a primitive and failed attempt to explain the world, which has been superseded by science. Science explains the world better than myth does. Myth was the early fumbling attempts before we knew what we were doing. And of course, that fits beautifully into the Great March of Progress, in which people in the past are stupid and primitive, and people in the modern world are advanced and smart. And this theme is reiterated. Both of these people are very thoughtful. So are the co-writers. Anne Druyan, who wrote on both of those series, is very thoughtful, student of history, but she sees with modernist eyes. It's almost impossible for a modern to think of a myth as anything but some kind of mistake, a mistaken story. It might be appealing, it might be entertaining, but it's wrong. That's at the core. And he's going to set us up to try to understand, if we want to understand the ancient world, we need to be able to set that definition to the side. We can pick it back up again whenever we want to talk about, myths as lies. Sure, I mean, it's easy to do in the modern world. But if we don't have the ability to put the lie definition to the side and temporarily take on the ancient definition of a myth, then we're never going to understand the ancient perspective. We will simply fail at this exercise. That's why this entire section is about contrasting mythos and logos. He's really trying to get us to the heart of what a myth is. So I'm going to read some, and then I'm going to get us into discussion some. Because Greek myth was the confluence of many folk tales and the assimilation of one deity to another, nearly the same. And of course, as I mentioned before, if you get the Robert Graves Greek Myths collection, in the footnotes of all the myths, he will talk at great length about all the variations from all the different tribes of the Greeks. First, he'll give you the version that you think that you read somewhere else in Bullfinch or Hamilton or wherever, and then he'll start to give you all these alternate versions you've never heard of, and who believed that and what were their weird little rituals. So this is what he's alluding to here. We know Kenneth Smith has read. He's read his Robert Graves. He recommends The White Goddess as one of his on his book list. He says myth is itself a Greek term, and of course that's where we have to pause for a moment. It's a Greek term. Right? So if we have to choose between the English definition of myth and the Greek definition of myth, we have to make sure we never lose track of the Greek definition. because it's their word. And this definition is important, even just for that reason, since we're talking about the Greeks. It's a Greek term describing a story or account that attempts to explain a subliminal kind of order. Attempts to explain a subliminal kind of order. That, and this is tying into Heraclitus, nature loves to hide. Where is the hidden harmony that explains the cosmos, the logos of the cosmos, and how things come into being and transform the way that they do? Well, it's hidden. It's obscure, it's subliminal, it's out of our reach. And as Heraclitus argued fiercely, and Hegel and the Hegelians and the existentialist tradition pick up and run with later, there is an element of paradox that's always built into the core principles of the cosmos. And paradox doesn't lend itself nicely to rational intellectual arguments. So the conscious rational mind has trouble with the deep order of the cosmos. We like our equations, right? We like our lines of logic and our simple categories. We don't so much like when we start to get into the deep stuff of the cosmos, like why do we have free will, or are our actions all predetermined? Science kind of has some trouble with that one. It's like, yeah, that's a philosophical question, and the reason that they offload it is because it's full of paradoxes. When you get to the deep kind of order of the cosmos, you find yourself in nests of paradoxes, a whole fabric of paradoxes. It's frustrating for the rational mind. And so he says, the thing that is to be explained by a myth is the very thing that logic and math and science have trouble with and don't really want to talk about very much. And that is this level of order that won't lend itself to the law of the excluded middle, that won't lend itself to logical syllogisms, that is obscure. And when people talk about Heraclitus and call him Heraclitus the obscure, this is what they're talking about. He's talking about this obscure layer of order in the cosmos. And what Kenneth is saying here is that the strong suit of myth is not that you can get famous as a storyteller or make a bunch of money. It's not that you can lie to a bunch of people. It's that it has this ability to explain that very level of order in the cosmos, which is the foundations that underpin rationality, that underpin science, that underpin logic, that are under it, and that those respective disciplines have a very hard time justifying using their own rules. They work best if you come into the picture with a foundation already established of certain things taken for granted. And that set of things to be taken for granted is drawing out of the deep paradoxical level of order of the cosmos. This is where myths are really good. This is what they're strong at. This is what he's saying here. I'll wrap up this sentence and then I'll call on Stephen. So myth is itself a Greek term describing a story or account, which is the part moderns are fine with. A story or account that attempts to explain a subliminal kind of order, which even after this formulation, even after you've experienced the myth, even after you've milked the myth for whatever it has to tell you, that subliminal kind of order nevertheless remains mysterious and dark. There is a way in which the kinds of materials that math and logic and science are good at, once they have been explained by math or logic or science, they are laid bare, they're illuminated. That's why they talk about Apollo as the god, not of the sun, but of illumination, enlightenment, right? Once you have learned Boyle's law, right, the behavior described by Boyle's law starts to make sense to you. It holds together and you go, oh, I see. You start to feel like you have some command over it. You could develop tools and technology using Boyle's law. But the difference is that this level of understanding, this level of the cosmos, this level of order that underlies all that stuff, every time you encounter it, the more you understand it, the deeper and darker and more mysterious it gets. Because you keep finding that the ground underneath you doesn't lend itself to the law of the excluded middle, doesn't drop into tidy categories. It seems to just weave into paradoxes in which everything is connected to everything else in ways that are baffling, and that refuse to justify themselves to us in the terms that our rational mind would prefer. Now, all of this is counter-modern, right? One of the key tenets of modernity is we can understand anything. If we study long enough, we'll understand everything. And eventually we'll be like gods, right? We'll have infinite tools, infinite technology, infinite understanding. We'll be able to make sense of everything, and there's really no limits to what we can do. But this ancient understanding that myth is predicated upon, part of the reason a modern can't accept the definition is that there's a cosmology built into the definition. And the cosmology is that it's not true, that there are limits to what we will ever be able to understand. The epistemology needs to be understood not as a great march of progress in which you fill your brain from empty to full and then eventually you know everything. It has to be understood as finite beings trying to understand an infinite cosmos. There are certain things we're going to be able to understand, and there's certain things that are just simply never going to resolve themselves into the patterns that we prefer for understanding. We're going to be frustrated. And that, unfortunately, the frustration is not on the farthest fringes of the universe that we will not get to in our lifetimes. The frustrations are right at the core of what it means to be alive and what it means to be human, why things exist at all, and what is the nature of time. All of these things, this stuff that permeates everything is where all the paradoxes are, the mysterious, the dark, the obscure, and the frustrating. So what he's saying in this sentence is quite a bit. I mean, you could unpack and write a whole chapter just about this sentence, but he's basically saying that human beings have two mental faculties for a reason. One of them is good at the linear stuff that will resolve down into facts and theorems. But the other faculty is better at handling this mysterious, dark, obscure stuff that refuses to resolve. That through storytelling and myth, we can get an unconscious, subliminal handle on these things that we can't get a conscious, rational handle on. And they give us a way to coexist in a world that's full of these frustrating paradoxes in a way that we could actually live a meaningful, effective life. So I'll come back to this in a moment, but let's start with Stephen and Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, no, I'm just going to say that we're sort of stuck. In recent modern times, we had a dichotomy, and that sort of was connected with Descartes. And Descartes' dichotomy was there's a mysterious world of mind, and there's external reality. There's the objective world, and science has had a great time with the objective world. It's hasn't absolutely mapped it out, but felt it had mapped it out enough. Well, particularly in the 19th century, come to the conclusion that the universe was clockwork. We can work it all out, no problem. But the minds, the consciousness still remains a mystery. They haven't worked out what's going on there. They've got a few ideas, but they haven't really. It doesn't fit, as you were pointing out, it just doesn't fit neatly with a nice mathematical clockwork vision of the universe, which was just doing so absolutely fantastic in the late 19th century. Nietzsche was a person who was stuck with that. He looked at that whole Newtonian clockwork vision, and he looked at it and he thought, I have to believe it because I'm a scientific mind. I have to believe it. But his instincts rebelled against the whole idea as being a limit to his freedom. But if he had just been there that little bit later, a third element was added, and that was quantum. That quantum doesn't fit neatly with a clockwork vision of the universe. So you have mind or consciousness, then you have the clockwork vision of the universe. Now, people claim that was where the Greeks were at. It'd be interesting to see if you think they were purely limited to that. But then the Greeks didn't know anything about quantum, or did they predict it? I don't know. So we've gone from two major elements that don't fit together to three elements that don't fit together. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, my thought is, of course, we do have a mind, obviously. That's part of our, I guess, our internal structure. But what is the relationship between the mind and the world, or the cosmos, if you want to expand it any further? My question, in a way, is like, which is first? That's a difficult thing to say, right? Is the cosmos the prime mover that we perceive and come to understand? Or are we, in some sense, a maker that articulate the impressions and construct the cosmos to our understanding? And I could sort of understand Kant in a sense, in this sense, and I actually like Kant. But the fact that we don't have an actual grasp of things as they are, but we do have a grasp of the appearance of the things. And so all we have is a representation. Now, to what degree is that representation authentic to the thing itself, and to what degree that is a sort of a projection of our understanding to the thing? I think that, in a way, I could sort of understand Plato and the divided line, in the sense that, the poets have a grasp of the mythic world, and but the ambiguity within that is like a lot of stuff is left invisible. And it seems to me something like rational thought, particularly embedded in, let's say, something like mathematics, becomes a tool that could become more precise in its measurements. So I could understand that. The question is that, is that tool something that actually talks about the real world, or is that, a mental apparatus? So how real is mathematics? Mathematics is amazing in the sense that sometimes it predicts things that you never thought of, and it's true. So it's actually, so you have to believe it to a certain degree that there's something very real about the power of the tool. Okay. And but I was thinking that even Einstein says, what quantum physics is, as like, he think of it as the, how should I say, the hidden variable, right? The visible and invisible. And I recently saw a video by Leonard Susskind talking to Brian Greene about quantum physics. And I like Leonard Susskind because Leonard Susskind, it's interesting. I've heard that many of the theoretical physicists started out, they wanted to be painters. They weren't very good at it. They went into quantum physics or whatever. And it's interesting. And Leonard Susskind happened to be one. And in fact, he said in his early life, he wanted to do art, but he really wanted to do real art. And he said he just couldn't compete with Picasso. So he gave up. He said, I'll take up science instead. And what he said, he and I guess somebody else looked into Einstein's equations that back, I think this is in terms of general relativity, he had already written some equations that had 2 points. One was something that was very, very similar to quantum tunneling. And the other one was very similar to what turned out to be quantum entanglement, which is very interesting. And they looked at it. There was three factors. So I don't know enough mathematics, nor did I look at the equation without understanding. There's a middle factor they both had, and they dropped that middle factor, and they came to the conclusion that, let's see, GR is equal to QM by dropping the middle factor, because the equation fit at roughly, it sort of says general relativity is actually equal to quantum mechanics. The fact that quantum tunneling, which I think many people believe in, I'm not sure that's true, but quantum entanglement, a lot of people, more and more people believe in that now, is that it seems to fit that actually is not a paradox. It appeared to be a paradox, but it actually isn't. So that was very interesting. And he sort of explained something about quantum entanglement that was interesting. He said, like if you look at, and he saw this by inference of a hologram. He said, if you look at an image that's produced by a hologram, a flat image, there's just a lot of random lines and random specks. It doesn't make any images at all. But apparently, if you shine a certain kind of light at it at a certain angle, it creates a refraction that the image appears, which is very interesting. And he says, if that image appears, then in a sense, this randomness that seems to say that these factors that had nothing to do with each other because they don't form an image, they appear. And he suggests that may be something like quantum entanglement at spooky distances. Because he's almost suggesting, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, that space is something that is so fundamental to our experience that we find it astonishing that our understanding of space may not be the way space is. Right? That in fact, the reason quantum entanglement happens is that the particle, they're actually right next to each other. They're actually right next to each other. We don't know it. There might be something in which space is a necessary function of our senses that, in a sense, produces this quantum field, but in a sense that makes it seem like it's very, very far away. But in fact, that begins to sound like Veda Veda religions. It's just very interesting. Okay, I'm not even claiming it's true. I just found his explanation interesting, and I found his explanation certainly about what you call holograms interesting. That it is just random marks that we do not see, and I guess Kant would not see in his categories. And I remember in a meeting, somebody said, Kant, this is just sort of abstraction. Kant says, I see that, I see pink, and somebody else says, no, Kant, I see blue, and Kant replies, well, you must be blind because it's obviously pink. And the other guy replied, Emmanuel, why don't you take off your rose-colored glasses and then tell me and tell me what color it actually is? So I came to the conclusion that the appearance that we see, that Plato lambasted between appearances and reality, in some sense, it's the essence of being, that we have to deal with that. And I think, I remember seeing a program on the rationalists. There was a guy named John Austin. I don't think he's as well known, but he seemed to be one of those kind of analytical thinkers, but he sort of tried to mediate that relationship. Happily, his name was very close to Jane Austen. And John Austen wrote a book called Sense and Sensibilia, instead of Sense and Sensibility. Sensibilia, he is trying to, in a sense, in a rough sense, quantify sensibility to a measurement sensibility that we actually could. In fact, I think if you think about it that way, that's what the social sciences are, is measuring sensibilia. You know, that in some sense, that's why the hard scientists is, oh, no, you guys are not scientists. Sensibility is a kind of almost a slightly ambiguous mythic measurement, if you want to call it that way, but it is about appearances, measurable appearances in a way. So I think we have a dual track in terms of constructing what reality is. The rational track, that's about negation, and the other track, which is about the relationship between the visible and the invisible. And I think that we have gone too far in the measurement track. You know, I talked about Seth and Osiris. It really started there, you know. So okay, I'll leave it there. Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Joseph, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
This would just a minor point. Getting outside of the scientific aspect of things, sometimes I think that one of the reasons that we fall in love and think that science is the answer versus a tool is that we start to fall in love with our predictions within a system. And I think that that's a major problem in the sense that we start to think we're applying a scientific method to something. And you're really not necessarily, you're just applying a method within a given structure. So within a given economic structure. And all of a sudden your predictions are correct. You can model what the world looks like. You can even use it, you do it using advanced scientific equations and mathematics, you know, and quantum physics. But that's just not the whole story. In fact, that's not only the whole story, but it's a very limited perspective on the world. And I had a friend that actually worked at a pretty high level on Wall Street, and says, if you give me enough data, I can predict anything. And he truly believed it. And he was very good at what he did. I don't deny that. But that he didn't see himself being sucked into the hubris of, you're just predicting what's going on in an economic system. It's this much of our reality. It's what we've actually created. So the fact that you can apply this, you know, approach and come up with, you know, predictions of a market doesn't necessarily mean that you have the answers to the universe. And I think that that's sometimes where we get sidetracked. That's all. It's not that I'm deviating from what Bill and Stephen had talked about a little bit, but I'm just saying this is something that can perpetuate the belief that we have the answers, and that the stories that underpin our instincts have no real value, because you can predict what's going on, what a person's going to do next. I mean, you can get very good at knowing, just how how a consumer is going to behave. And you start to believe that, it's a very narrow perspective, but it's not necessarily all that separate from what we were talking about from the modernist point of view. I just think it's one of those things that helps, I don't know, perpetuate this myth, this other myth that we actually believe about ourselves. And so, I realize I misused the word there in the context of the meeting, but perpetuates this lie, I should say, in this case, that we have more answers than we actually do. So I think that that's just one part of when we're thinking about having these conversations as to why it's people will disregard myth, is because it's our even as a consumer, you're like, oh wow, people can predict exactly what I'm going to do, so you start to believe that everything is somewhat right in front of you, and that there's no other options in the world, and that this is the way the world works, and that all cause and effect can be predicted by some model. And it's just it also lacks imagination. It's also the reason we can't get out of certain cycles, in the sense that we perpetuate kind of this idea that this is a cycle, this is the way things are, and this is the way it's going to be. And the world just doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's it. It feeds the hubris. That's all. So I know that's a little bit outside of what the previous two comments have been, shared, but at the same time, I think it's relevant. Because even people that don't necessarily think about the universe also have this way of thinking that myth has no value. And that's problematic.
Thank you, Joseph. Donald, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll talk about myth as a modern. We occasionally on here talk about Kurt Gödel and everybody likes to talk about his inconsistency theorem, but his incompleteness theorem points the way. There are, if you structure your axioms so that you avoid the inconsistency, that is, the axiom system is too strong and can prove everything, that is, even false statements, is why it leads to inconsistency. So you have a relatively weaker axiom system, then you'll leave things unproven. And the question to me is, what do these things look like? Well, they could look like myths. Statements that contain truths that are of such a scope, particularly universal scope, perhaps, trying to gather up whole very broad properties of all that is, like what's the shape of the universe? Now, some things we know it's very flat because astronomers measure very large triangles, and they all come up to, 9 sigma or something, to having 180 degrees in flat space, in empty space. So they say, hey, we really do live in something kind of like Euclidean space. But other properties can't be determined from within a system. They're properties of the system as a whole, and one would need to have some viewpoint outside a system, but the system, you can't get outside it. And myths might be a good way. That's the kind of truths we find, not necessarily physics truths in Greek myth. But moral and ethical truths about human nature, things that psychiatry, psychology, medicine will never be able to sort of arrive at deductively or experimentally, about how we should behave, how we should act, what we should choose. Myths address more the wisdom side, not the knowledge side of our existence. And that's enough.
Thanks, Donald. Well, with that, let's go back to the text. Oh, wait, we have Sharon. Go ahead, Sharon. What's on your mind? Come off mute.
So I want to agree with what Donald said, because I think myth for the Greeks and myth now, it's very different, but it's also very simple. Because the next sentence, it says, myth was indeed the ingenious precursor of philosophical culture in this way. So the myth for the Greeks helped them explain their reason to be. Whereas for modern man, myth tends to be a governing tool. It's a political entity. It's a social entity. And that's where the difference is. I find it very different, but there's a lot of simplicity and it's different. It's the way human beings operate now. And for example, one of the myths we have in this society is that we're very individualistic, which is not true. Human beings are interdependent. That's how we were made. And again, that's politics. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Sharon. So yeah, let's dive into the text. I agree. So next sentence, not next from where Sharon was, but backing up to the middle of the paragraph. In myth, men accommodate their intuitive minds to forms of order that nature itself imposes on them. And it's another one of those sentences it's easy to read past, but this idea that nature is orderly, nature has its laws. This is all straight Heraclitus, and that in the freedom that we have developed as a species to be able to behave not according to a limited script of instincts, but according to a really wide range of possible acculturations, presents us with this problem that most species don't have, which is how are we to choose among this enormous bounty of options? What is the thing that we are to do? And Heraclitus argues strenuously and repeatedly that the challenge is to not get addicted to your own private intelligence and its idiosyncratic ideas about what you should do. The trick is to try to learn enough about the world. And in this, he's a precursor to the natural scientists, that you need to learn a lot about the natural world so that you could begin to infer how the logos works. What are the deep laws of nature? What are the deep principles? And then that you can let those guide you. What is common to all is how he expresses this. You can let the intelligence that is common to us all guide us instead of our own idiosyncratic delusions and ideologies and what have you. So that's built right into this, is this idea of when he says men accommodate their intuitive minds to forms of order that nature itself imposes on them. What's implicit in this sentence is, as opposed to forms of order that the people try to impose on themselves, or that some people try to impose on others. In other words, myth is a way, and again, this is completely missing from the modern definition. Myth is a way to help reshape yourself to be guided less by artificial ideas about the world, whether they're yours or whether they're your society's, and to try to be guided more by natural ideas about the world. That's the intelligence inherent in nature. There's some Nietzsche in here, right? You can see Nietzsche's obsession with health and vitality and natural man is building off of these same ideas that Heraclitus is talking about, that nature has a wisdom to it, that even if we don't slavishly follow it at all times, we at least have to completely accept that it is authoritative, and that whatever we do, even if it's not in agreement with it, it has to circumnavigate it or work around it or work with it. It's the elephant in the room. It's the 600-pound gorilla. It's not safe to lose track of the forms of order that nature imposes on us. And by imposition, this is also a reference to the difference between praxis and pathos, right? Because a pathos is something we have to just suffer. A pathos is something that is imposed upon us, as opposed to a praxis, which is where we are the actors and we try to exert our will upon the world. And in this, we get again to this split in function between these two, metabolic resources of the mind, that our intellect, our reason is tightly bound up with our will. The whole reason why we reason is so that we can exert our will. That's why that faculty develops in us. And that therefore is the more praxis side of the mind. Whereas what we are born with as infants and what we develop and eventually, grow reason out of, the soil we grow reason out of, is this other faculty, which is about accommodating ourselves. This entire structure of the sentence, once you see the relationships between these mental faculties and how they connect us to the world and each other, you can see that this sentence is rife with pointers pointing to gnosis, to this part of the mind that is about how do we teach ourselves to shut up and stop acting and adapt directly to what is, to sense what is, and respond and let it guide us, to respond to it in a feedback loop, that the way that a plant does, the way that an animal nests itself into its ecosystem. This is what gnosis is for in us, and it's why it's the older faculty evolutionarily in us. I mean, without that, we never would have survived long enough to develop reason in the first place, right? I mean, if you can't accommodate yourself to nature and its forms of order, what chance do you have to strategize about what you're going to do, with the life that you've preserved so far doing that? So he's basically making a strong argument here about a connection between mythos and gnosis, and saying that all the things that mythos is strong at are the things that gnosis in us is good for. And so in doing this, he is, and we're going to see more and more of this as this paragraph goes along, he is not just talking about some abstract form of art or religion or what have you when he talks about myth. He's not just talking about some psychological phenomenon. He's talking about the glue that allows us to connect to the world, make sense of it, and choose our activities and actions within it. This feedback loop in which, even if we talk about man as an individual, man is not an individual because man is in the world. And the world and man are in a continuous dialogue in which man has to figure out how to relate to the larger circumstances. And gnosis is one of the ways of doing that. It's not just a way of passively standing back and perceiving in the world and knowing it like an armchair philosopher. It's about engaging you into life and what you're going to do and how you're going to live. So, Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, first I want to point out that I put in chat about John Austin, the book. a couple of videos, so you could look that up if you want to. The next thing is, I'm glad you mentioned ecological cycles, because part of the problem, I think science is beginning to move in that direction more, is that beyond the objects in the world, there's relationships between objects that in some sense, maybe the objects themselves don't even know, but they sense and they respond to, okay? And that's the ecological cycle of living things. I'm sure there might be a cycle of just inanimate objects also, who knows what the cycle is. I guess in some way we knew that even better than ecological cycle of living things, because we do have star charts and all that going all the way back to certainly Babylonia and all that, about how the movement of the planets. Even though we got it wrong, the computer models are actually very accurate the way they have it, okay? The invention, which is interesting, by the way. I'll just mention that, like when you look at the Earth-centered universe, of course, they have to invent epicycles and all sorts of things, right? But if you look at that and its predictive power, it's actually very, very accurate. I mean, to the degree that they could extend the visions to, without telescopes and the whole bit, so that's interesting. But we know that's wrong because they position in the wrong place. Okay, so in some sense, you could say, well, maybe our model is kind of like the ancients Earth-centered model, like, oh yes, that's correct again. yes again, correct, right? How precise? It must be right. Okay, so I think that ecological cycle also happened in society too, because human beings have developed civilization that's big enough that it actually is an ecological cycle in itself. So when you move in a social structure, whether it's in the city or in a nation, in a way, it's not just you, and it's not just you and your girlfriend or your wife or whatever, but it's that expands to a greater system. It's all, in a sense, involved in some way. Now, at some point, like it's just beyond an individual's ability to manage it, and so it gets out of hand. But I think Hegel was sharp to understand. In fact, he probably focused that on more than on nature, that ecological cycle had its own development in its own way, and that's why the history, and that's what. And by the way, which is interesting, because he put so much emphasis on the mind, but in fact, the mind is to a certain degree semi-blind, because remember the hour Minerva takes flight at dusk, right? In other words, we only look back, oh yeah, that's how the day went. Rather than in the morning, oh, this is how the day is going to go. Like, I guess there are psychologists who tell think of yourself crossing the finish line first, over and over again, and then it will come true. I'm not so sure about that. And anyway, that's psyching yourself up. So I think that the complexity of that is not only the individual objects, and science has, up to this point, been focused too much on the object itself rather than the process, and even the human body. One of the problem with the Greeks, and I don't mean there's a problem, but I like it, is that they never really, how should I say, dissected a live human being, because they respected the human body so much, right? That I said, no, this is territory we don't want to go into. So like somebody like Galen, well, in fact, Galen didn't do it either. It's like they got things wrong in a sense, because they just say, oh, it must be a little bit like a pig's anatomy, and and try to speculate the relationship. But the system is different. And anybody who's met in medicine understand that, like sometime, something could be what you didn't expect directly that had an influence in relationship to something else. So you have to understand the system in order to diagnose the whole. And sometimes the funny thing is the system is the lack of something rather than the presence of something. So which is kind of interesting. Oh yeah, you didn't have enough vitamin C. That's the reason, right? So the absent is a secret part of it itself. So I just think that we are fooling ourselves and think that we're a heck of a lot smarter than we are. In fact, we are still a bunch of bumbling fools trying to figure out things. And we're pretty smart, but we're not so smart as to suddenly, we got the end game all figured out. So I think humility is a good thing. I mean, to a certain degree. I mean, you don't want to be so humble you're afraid to do any damn thing. But you got to say, maybe I'm wrong. If you don't have that prospect of saying, it is possible that I'm wrong, then you're in a lot of trouble, as far as I'm concerned. All right, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. So I guess the other thing to pull out of this sentence, and I'll read it again for the folks who've just joined, in myth, men accommodate their intuitive minds to forms of order that nature itself imposes on them. So this is in section F, Mythos and Logos, from chapter 4 of Millennia and Microcosm. This is in the 4th paragraph. And we talked a moment ago about how there's this strong connection between, therefore, myth and gnosis as a mental function. That what Hegel would later describe in its naive form as Begriff and in its sophisticated form as Vernunft. But this gnosis, this connection to the world, this is part of what he means there. But also let's forms of order that nature itself imposes on them, that should ring a bell, because earlier we were talking about what mythology and religion are to the Greeks, and that the purpose of the deities within the perspective of Greek mythology is to draw attention to aspects of nature that we don't dare overlook, that are because they're too authoritative over our lives. And if we aren't paying attention to those things, we're just going to have the equivalent of a traffic accident with life. It's like the guy who thinks that his powers of reason are all powerful and he doesn't have to pay attention to emotion at all is just waiting for a tragedy based around Aphrodite. He's going to fall head over heels for somebody and lose his mind. And the Greeks loved stories like this. They talked about all the times when somebody with plenty of power was swept away by the power of Aphrodite. For example, the entire Trojan War is based on the awarding of the golden apple to Aphrodite and the gift that she gives to Paris, which leads to the ruin of Bronze Age civilization across the Mediterranean, right? I mean, there is this way in which the forms of order that nature imposes on people are forms of order that it would be deadly for us, and more than deadly. I mean, it goes beyond one person dying. The Trojan War is a bigger deal. The collapse of Bronze Age civilization is a bigger deal than one person dying. We're talking epic level tragedies ensue when people lose track of the forms of order that nature imposes on us. So when he says in myth, men accommodate their intuitive minds to this, what he's also saying is that there is this need to make it your own second nature to always be sensitive to those critical aspects of nature that can bowl us over, whether it is our temptations to fight, our temptations for attraction, our love of reason and intelligence. There's all these different things that are being personified by the deities in the Greek pantheon. And the Greeks believe that if you lose track of even one of those, that absence will be the story of the tragedy of your life, right? This is the structure of tragedy. You can have all the gifts, but the one you don't have, that's what your story is going to be about. The thing that you overlooked. As Cleon says in Oedipus Tyrannus, the unheeded thing escapes. The thing that you missed is what gets you in trouble. And this is why, as well, it's the intuitive mind, the unconscious mind, the subliminal mind, the large part of the mind that isn't the rational part, that myth is trying to tune up and arm with this sensitivity to make sure that you don't miss these things. Because remember, the conscious part of the mind can only keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 things. And whenever you're trying to actually solve a problem or do something in the world, a bunch of those tracks are busy solving that problem. And that means they're not out looking around to say, I wonder if I'm pissing off the gods right now. I wonder if I'm tempting fate. I wonder what I'm overlooking. Your conscious mind doesn't have room for that stuff. This is part of why the conscious and unconscious mind, why noesis and gnosis need to work in such a partnership. Because while noesis works with this focused energy to try to solve problems, gnosis is there trying to, remember where you are in the world and how things feel and what the temperature is, and are you feeling a little uncomfortable with this current situation? And it's trying to keep track of the larger picture. So that's exactly where you want to be watching the forms of order that nature itself imposes on them, so that watching can go on even when you're consciously paying attention to something else. This idea of this partnership and this division of labor, and this idea that the most urgent, important things are the things that you want your unconscious mind to be focused on, that's its strength. This is a little weird for moderns. We're used to thinking that reason and the conscious part of the mind is the strong part. So if you had something important, you should give it to your conscious mind. But here the Greeks are going, oh no, the conscious mind is too easily distracted. It's the unconscious mind that you have to give these really important awarenesses to, because it can stay sensing and paying attention to what's going on around it, even while your conscious mind is busy tied up somewhere else. And that's why halfway through, wasting an entire day programming, having forgotten to eat, my unconscious mind is the part that says, hey, dummy, you're hungry. I didn't consciously decide. All of my registers were busy programming, but my unconscious mind can step in and go, what would be stupid right now would be to go through the whole day without a meal. That would be dumb. So this is what he's talking about, the use of myth as a method of shaping your unconscious mind so that it can remain always aware of the most important things. Remember that earlier, we've talked in earlier weeks about this relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind, where the conscious mind thinks it's in control, but it's the unconscious mind that decides what you noticed in the first place. So when your conscious mind is choosing what to work on, it's choosing from a menu pre-selected for it by the unconscious mind. So after all, there's an infinite number of things, and you don't have an infinite amount of conscious attention. So, but your unconscious is vast, and it can constantly be feeling around and drawing things to your attention once it realizes, hey, maybe there's something important there. And then your conscious mind thinks that it's noticed it. So, that's all tied up in what's going on here in this sentence. So this sentence is tying a lot of things together that are easy for an ancient to hear and attend to, but are easy for a modern to overlook with our focus on the conscious mind. So with that in mind, that sets us up for the next sentence. So he says, myths reveal oblique and difficult truths. And we've talked about that part earlier in this paragraph, about human nature. So now he's talking about, remember, we've talked about the idea that human beings are amphibians who inhabit two infinities, the infinity of the world and nature and its laws around us, and then the infinite depths of our own character and unconscious mind, either one of which we could get lost in. And, how do you shift back and forth between the two? How do you navigate between your scientific models and what's actually happening before you? These are challenges that, people have been writing about for millennia. And so here he's shifting the focus away from the world around us, the nature and its laws around us, to the nature and its laws within us, the truths about human nature. And of course, when he talks about human nature in the Greek sense, he's also talking about character. Right? We had an earlier section in this chapter about character and about how character is your own nature. It's your own logos. It is that gnosis. It is that subliminal part of your mind that is choosing and selecting what you pay attention to, right? If I'm born with the unlucky alcoholic gene and I haven't, worked myself over to deal with that, then my nature is going to make me notice alcohol nearby. And it will look interesting to me. It will look appealing to me because I was born that way. My wife doesn't have this problem. She doesn't have the gene. I've got the gene. I notice alcohol wherever it is. That's my character at work within me. And the only reason why I don't fall prey to it is I follow Heraclitus's advice and I cultivate my character to try to say, okay, it's okay to notice, but it's not okay to act on it. I have to respond to the noticing with a turning away. So what he's saying here is that, and this goes to the heart of religion and what a religion is, that in the previous sentence, he's talking about the way that myths teach us about the order of the nature around us. And now he's talking about that myths teach us about the nature of the order within us, our own character, and that they're connecting the two. So I'm going to step away for 30 seconds. My cat wants to be let out. I'll be right back. Give me just a moment. Sorry, yeah. Okay, baby, come on up.
How's everybody doing?
Okay, that's better.
Good.
Okay.
All right.
Teacher's back. We can't talk.
Teacher's back.
now.
All right, so we got questions. Let's go with our questions. Let's start with Phil. What's on your mind, Phil?
This poses a problem because we know that at least certain individuals are in control of things that mediates. I mean, think of let's start with Oedipus, right? Oedipus, of course, destiny is both a manifestation of his own abilities and fate. And fate, that part is controlled by the gods. I mean, he didn't know that he was going to kill his father. That was fate. He tried his best to avoid it, as a matter of fact. He didn't know he was going to end up marrying his mother. He tried to avoid that, but the gods are intervening. Okay, so there's some other power that's manifesting us beyond our consciousness, maybe even our unconsciousness. Maybe they seep through our unconsciousness. Then you have religion. You presume that God is good. He may indeed be good, but the church fathers may not be good. And it took a while, but you eventually realize, oh, wait a minute. They're not giving us the straight story. They're skimming off the top, let's call it that way. We're left with nothing except continuing to pray to them and, of course, receiving the sacraments from them, which is just another sort of lie. Then I come to the contemporary world and I'm thinking, oh my God, we are not in control of ourselves, because guess what? Business and advertising, they understand the unconscious, the subconscious. They are appealing to a subconscious, signaling us to want things that we did not even know we wanted. And so therefore, we're already being sidelined. In fact, in some ways, it's worse than fate. I mean, like, are these advertisers and the ability to brand things and all that kind of stuff, are they gods or demigods that is manipulating our fate? We thought our destiny, we thought we had at least some control of our destiny. It turns out, why am I buying this thing that I didn't even want? I mean, it's like, well, you know, like, do you cut the umbilical cord and say, oh, that's it. I'm moving to the Yukon territory by myself. I mean, like, you're kind of trapped. You're in the system, and yet the system, you know, is manipulating you. You just know that. It's true. Okay. And when it gets to a point that even when, you know, like Facebook or whatever, it's manipulating you, it's like, wow, you know, that's it. So how do we get away from this? How do we get away from the mediation that urges us in our subconscious that we not have, at best, minimum control, it has full control of us, you know? Like I said, you know, you walk that aisle innocently, and suddenly you look at this thing, oh God, I want that. It's calling your attention to this thing. Like, I mean, maybe from now on when I go to the store, I should just wear these like blinders the horses have. So I don't look around and say, oh God, I like to have some of that. So how do you survive in a situation when you can't even control your own fate? I mean, like, where is your destiny? Your destiny is in the hands of, you know, the corporate executives. So I'll just leave it at that. It's like, we're in a worse situation than Oedipus ever was. I think it's time for me to marry my mother.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, advertising is certainly the classic example of the proof that there is an unconscious mind. Even people who wish that there wasn't and argue with all their might that there can't possibly be, the moment we discuss the success of advertising, they sort of get quiet and go, yeah, well. There's that. So it's a great example. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, we better not forget that we're living myths every night when we dream. I try to write down, you know, what I've been dreaming about, but I tend to find that I lie in bed thinking about other things when I wake up, and I suddenly realise, oh, I've forgotten the dream. What was going on there? It was really far out, but I've forgotten it. Somehow there seems to be a gap between the way the conscious mind operates and the dreaming mind operates. But if you get a little bit lucid, sometimes you can just see a bit of the operation of the dream, and it's really crazy. You're creating ideas or images in your mind, and you're stirring the pot in just some way that your conscious day mind is just not going to do. You just got that cauldron going around. You're creating some really crazy stuff. And when you get the rationalist saying, the only reality is the day waking mind and the rational thoughts, which we can go on. If I had a thought about a tree, I can go over that tree and check out my thoughts to see if they're accurate. That's all there is to it. We'll forget completely about dreams, you know. It's not like some ancient Bronze Age king would have some persistent, troubling dreams about marrying his mother or something like that and go off to see the oracle. What the hell's going on here? They took it seriously back then, but we don't. We say dreams are silly. We can just ignore them and forget about them, and we don't bother. But no, myth. We have it every night. Dreams are myths. Our minds are full of myth. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's certainly core to how Kenneth is talking about these things here. You know, that this claim about gnosis and its relationship to mythos, its relationship to the unconscious mind, is not a claim. I mean, we all experience it every night. Every night we experience it. And you know, notoriously, dreams frustrate the conscious mind. You know, I was in my house and I went out what should have been the back door, and I was in my grandma's house from my childhood. That house hasn't even been around for 30 years. How can I be there? And the conscious mind is bad. No, this is not acceptable. But the unconscious mind is, sure, why not? You know, I can go with this transformation. All things flow, right? It's fine. This is how the world is. There is a level at which things are what they are and they're not what they're not, but there's a whole other murky, paradoxical level of order at which things are interconnected and complicated in important ways. And we all experience that every night. Joseph, go ahead. What's on your mind?
You know, one of the, the issues, and Phil touched upon it, with the idea of humility and the importance of humility in all of this. And I think about it in terms of when it comes to when Kenneth writes about religion in particular. He writes about religion as non-dogmatic, different from the way we perceive religion today, where they have all the answers and where they have a closed perspective on the world. In fact, that they feel like they defined everything, and that's just as dangerous as anything else that's out there. But then there's the Greek way of actually looking at it, which is completely different. It's trying to address the most important matters of the day, is the way he put it. And I was just actually wondering if you can compare and contrast that, because it's not just moderns. I don't know if you can blend moderns and dogmatic religion together. It's like, compare and contrast the religious Greek's version of religion and the modern way of religion, the way we've kind of, and I only call it modern in the sense that they think they have all the answers. And that's an important distinction to be able to make. Anyway, and I think what you see as a common theme is a lack of humility. And that's the biggest issue. Then you stop relying on principles and start relying on rules. And I think that that's a bigger issue as well. Because then you start to think that this rule applies in all circumstances. And that's where I was going a little bit earlier with these ideas of, with the systems that we think we can, we come up with rules or laws, even, Moore's law, something along those lines, that's a law that exists within a system. It's not a law, it's not something of the universe, or, there's other laws. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, I think it's important to say that, to compare and contrast that distinction, because there's what the Greeks thought about religion and defined it, and how we've kind of commercialized religion, and how that dichotomy between the two of those, that's something I think we could expand on a little, if you don't mind, because I know that's a couple of sections. I still think it's kind of important to kind of go over that distinction.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, he's gonna talk about that over and over in this book. It's a recurring theme, and part of where it comes from is, in Greek times, religion was a tool of anthropoculture for sure. I mean, they were engineering themselves as a culture to try to lift themselves out of their dark age and try not to repeat the collapse from the Bronze Age civilization, which they did for a while, but then it failed. But by the late ancient period, by the time you get to the Roman Empire, their approach to religion it's like playing a big game of chicken with nihilism. I guess is what I want to say, where it's being used more overtly as a tool of empire. I mean, generals, people who are thinking about coup d'etats, emperors, they're all thinking very consciously about how to manipulate the religion in order to manipulate the population. And one could argue that the Greco-Roman merger that we were all taught in elementary school when we were first exposed to Greek religion and Roman religion said, oh, they're just about the same thing. That they weren't just about the same thing. That didn't just happen. That was something that the Romans did to their own religion at the time that they conquered the Alexandrian Empire. And they did it in order to pull the winds of rebellion out from under any potential attempt to reverse the conquest. They said, oh, you don't have to fight us because we're you. Look, our gods are your gods. And in fact, if anything, we're more Greek than you are, because look how true we are to this religion that you say is the cornerstone of your culture. So how can you fight us when we're you? And that whole stage of the transformation of Roman religion is not talked about much by moderns. We pretty much just treat the alignment of Zeus and Jupiter and Mars and Aries as just happened to be that way. But it didn't just happen to be that way. And one of the ways we know is if you study the Flavian emperors who came after the Julian dynasty. And what you see in the Flavian Empire emperors is that they're conquering the Middle East. They're conquering Israel, and they're the ones who burned the temple, which is much deplored in the Bible. But they're the ones who did that. They're the ones who conquered it. At the time that they conquered it, Jews made up 10%. Jewish people made up 10% of the Roman Empire. I mean, it's hard to imagine how much bigger Judaism was by comparison back then to what it is today. And they were very militant, and they fought hard. And so the Flavian emperors had this neat trick, which is they tried to repeat what the Romans had done when they conquered the Hellenistic folks, which is they began to assimilate Yahweh and say, it did long before Constantine. There was this stage when they started to try to assimilate and say, oh, we're the second coming of Jesus. We're the saviors who are going to save you from, being trapped within these cycles. And they started to put out coins that said goodwill on earth and a peace on earth and goodwill to men. And a lot of these slogans that we associate with Christianity started as Roman propaganda during the Flavian period to try to convince the Jews that the Romans were just as Jewish as the Jews were. So how could you fight us? And, long before Constantine, there was an earlier push to make Christianity the attractive form of Judaism that Jews should convert to, instead of the militant form that kept fighting back against the Romans. Now, the Flavian changes in this direction got reversed after the Flavian period by emperors who were like, okay, that's a bridge too far. We were willing to stretch that far to be more Greek than the Greeks, but we're not willing to go that far and try to be more Jewish than the Jews. But there was a period of, some decades where they were in fact trying to do that. And you can find the evidence in coins, you can find it in mausoleums, in tombs, and all over the place. It's very interesting. It was a Roman thing to do, to manipulate the religion, to manipulate the people, and try to disarm the rage by saying we're all one people. How can you fight us? You'd be fighting yourselves. We're you. So that's quite different from the Greek period. And this is the ancient world, but it's already transformed so much. By the time you get to the Romans, and yet still you wouldn't mistake it for the medieval period, where there's only one God and our God is the right God, and all other gods, all other religions must be exterminated, and you can either convert or die. Those are your choices. It was a pretty much straight up imperial genocidal impulse that ran for 1,000 years. And when you see the level of hubris that's required, I mean, even the cynicism of the Romans begins to look sweet and naive by comparison with the hubris of there is only one God. We know which one he is, and you convert or die, and that's it. The Romans didn't do that. As cynical as the Romans were, wherever they went, they put up temples to whoever the local gods were. They're like, hey, if you got a God we don't have, we do not want to offend your gods. But by the time you get to the medieval period, they're like, those aren't gods. And we know they're not. We're certain, 100% certain those aren't gods. and we'll just pave them over and build our own temple on top to our own God everywhere we go. This is a just radical transformation. And Stephen talks about atheism and secular humanists in the modern era and some of the struggles that they have in the absence of a religion to give them a coherent ethical system. One of the things that you see happening in the medieval period, it's been characterized as atheism, but one. That is to say, it's easy for us to underestimate how big a change it was from the ancient epoch to the medieval epoch, to go from saying there's an enormous number of gods, and of course we don't know them all. We're not gods. We're finite mortals who have a limited understanding, and we've got to search and explore and try to understand the world of the sacred. To go from that to the medieval perspective of we know exactly what the sacred is, and anything that we don't say is sacred is absolutely not sacred. In fact, it's demons, and it must be exterminated. It is fundamentally atheism. It's atheism. That's what you see in the medieval genocidal impulse, is an atheism that believes that none of the gods are real, but we'll make an exception for the one. This one will make an exception for, but the rest of them, it's straight up atheism. So from the medieval perspective to the modern perspective, you're asking about that confidence and certainty. It's really just the medieval atheism taken to the next logical step, which is, well, you got rid of all the other gods, and your arguments, if they are persuasive for why we should get rid of Jupiter and Thor and all of the others, well, then they apply just as well to why we should get rid of your favorite god too. There's this transformation in which the medieval epoch is hoist on its own petard. And the only chance they had of avoiding that was to demonstrate that indeed the Christian religious people were more sacred, saintly, kind, virtuous than the others. But by the process of corruption that happened over the 1,000 years until, by the time of Martin Luther, the church was just intolerably corrupt, that would seem to be the only refutation they needed for making an exception for Jesus. At that point, they could say, well, then he doesn't seem to be even keeping his own church from being corrupt. So therefore, we're just going to put aside the whole question of gods and make that a private hobby for Sundays. And we're going to make a new society that's based on laws and money and so forth. So I think that's where the confidence comes from. I think it's the medieval confidence, just taken one more step. So blah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Rob, welcome to the call. What's on your mind? Got to come off mute.
Is it unmuted? It is unmuted now.
Yeah,
Hello.
You're good.
So this is the first set. I just got like a random email notification that this was happening right now, and just jumped in. And I don't really know Kenneth Smith, but I did read the paragraph. I just did give this preface in case what I'm about to say isn't, appropriately relevant. Hopefully you can forgive me, but I read the thing, so I think it is. Earlier, Rick, you said, we can only keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 things. And it seems like the role that myth is playing in our ability to, conceive of the world is to try and solve this problem of we don't actually have like the computing power, so to speak, to keep up with the amount of information that actually is in reality. And so we need to use abstractions like mythologies to sort of group large sets of phenomenon together so that we can actually keep up with in any sort of like meaningful way with reality, I suppose. And then earlier, sorry, it's like a lot of threads. I'm trying to like keep track of it all in my head. Earlier, Joseph said something that was also relevant to this that I can't retrieve at the moment. But yeah, I just thought this was an interesting aspect of how this relates to like human cognition is almost as like a solution to a puzzle of like, well, we're given tools that are frankly inadequate for the project we're set up with, which is using the external world to like using the understanding of the external world to manipulate it for our own sort of gains, or, you know, desires and aversions and stuff like that. It's an effort to overcome that difficulty is what mythology supplies us with. And maybe it's more like the emotions and passions are the solution to that, and mythology is our methodology of building up that solution. So like I said, hopefully that's not just like I'm just like the new guy who came in. So hopefully that's not irrelevant.
You're good, Rob. You're good. That's right on target. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is what Kenneth Smith's trying to do in this book. It's a project to try to help us to, you know, when we think in a modern way, from a modern worldview, a modern perspective, that until we go through this project, or unless we've been lucky enough in life, it's generally involuntary. We're just acculturated to see the world in a modern way. And as long as we do that, we're sort of prisoners of that worldview because we don't have the option of ever leaving it. We've never considered it. And when we look at and study other epochs of history where people had different worldviews, as long as we don't realize that we're stuck in the modern worldview, we tend not to see them as they were, but as something that satisfies and reinforces the modern worldview. That is to say, we don't see them as actual people, but we see them as what we might say is, you know, steps in an argument about why the modern worldview is right. So, for example, the tendency to assume that people in the past are more primitive than we are and that we're more advanced, and to assume that people in the past were less good than we are and we're more good. There's this kind of great march of progress thing that's sort of built into modernity as an assumption. It makes it very difficult for us to look at medievals and ancients and see them in their own terms. How did they see the world? So the purpose of this book is he's going to walk us through 3 epochs, and he's starting with the ancient epoch, especially with the Greeks, although we venture into Egyptians and Romans and others from time to time, and to try to help us understand the ancient worldview so crisply that we could actually try taking off the modern worldview and putting on the ancient worldview and reinterpreting things from an ancient perspective. And the goal is not to leave us stuck in the ancient perspective, right? But to be able to switch between these 2 hats and say, okay, so I can look at things now with binocular vision from an ancient perspective and a modern perspective. And then in the second section of the book, he's going to do the same for the medieval perspective and try to get us to understand the medieval worldview in its own terms, again, different from the ancient and different from the modern. And then we have trinocular vision. You sort of have the ability to shift between 3 worldviews. And then the final thing that he's going to do in this book in the last chapters is he's going to come back to the modern worldview and say, so what if we don't take modernity's word for it about what modernity is? What if we use these other 2 worldviews that we now have the ability to put on and take off, and we turn them to look at the modern world and say, what would they say about the modern world? What does modernity look like from outside of itself? And so he comes through a characterization of modernity that's entirely different. And hopefully the result at the end of the book is we're able to, we can walk away from this able to shift perspectives, able to study other perspectives that were never part of this book and try to do the same thing with them and so forth. So kind of what he's doing here in this section is he's trying to explore this issue. This is section F, and it's called Mythos and Logos. And he's trying to explore, how did the Greeks think the relationship went between things that, information that's mythic versus information that's kind of rational and logical and well organized in an intellectual fashion. So it's this. So what you said was right on target, but I just wanted to give you that extra context just to bring it up to speed. So thanks for your comments, and I'll go to Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I what's on my mind is I wanted to respond to Joseph about the problem of rule-based I guess, religion or governance or whatever it is. I tend to equivocate between them in a sense. But what I found in a way is that, the three original virtues of truth, goodness, and beauty. To me, I see it as a calling. The calling that sometimes sees that it fits in relationship to the rules, sometimes that it transcends the rules.
Right.
And if you see it as a calling, then you're moving toward the calling, sometime in a private manner, sometime in a kind of a more of a sociological order. But I think the calling is an original voice that we all have. Maybe I shouldn't say all, but fundamentally human beings do provide, because I think, at least in small circle, let's say think back into the tribal society, I think there is an essence of goodness that you want to relate to others, at least in your tribe. Maybe not in relationship to another tribe. So I think that's kind of almost a natural thing. I don't think any tribe could exist if everybody was brutalizing everybody else. I think people eventually abandon the tribe, and it would dissolve on its own. So I think goodness, it's just part of human beings growing up in a group. So I think that's good. I think truth is same thing, a calling for you to find out what the hell is going on, and I think that's sometimes rule-based. It helps you because measurements do help you, but sometimes it's wrong because what happened is the rules harden itself, and then it reinforces the same thing you're looking at, and then you say, oh yeah, we got it, it's right there. So the proof is like always, in a sense, an authentication of what you originally want to look for to begin with. So, and I think in terms of beauty, I think we're all moved by beauty in this way. It's a very complex situation, because it seems to authenticate some sort of harmony in relationship, whether that's to nature or to the painting you're working on, or or the government you're talking about. So I think these are very fundamental intuitions that we all have, that's been developed throughout the eons of human existence that we have. And what happened in a rule-based situation, when you were saying that, I was thinking particularly of legalism. Generally speaking, in America, we think of legalism is good in the final analysis because it's a contentious relationship where people actually get to debate and come out for something that approximates truth to what the situation is. But I was thinking of legalism in terms of Chinese history, as much as I know of it. It was a system of manipulating the people by constructing a legal structure in which prohibits certain things, kind of corral them into a channel that you're going to flow into, okay? And then what legalism does is that it provided in a kind of a carrot and a stick. The carrot is that, if you do good, according to our legal procedures, you will be rewarded with this. Of course, who doesn't want the free stuff? So in that sense, you're pulled toward the legality of something, and that eventually harden. And then, of course, if you veer away from that, then of course you're kind of a criminal. You've gone off the rails, so to speak. Kind of a criminal. You're punished. So reward and punishment becomes a tool to help channel people in a certain direction. Oh my gosh, I certainly see that with the CCP now. That's why I kind of think that CCP, You know, I remember a couple sessions ago, I said that, you know, China is not Chinese. I mean, there is a part of it that's Chinese, that the legalistic part, I think it is. They constructed the legal system in such a way that it is, it has a history in it. But China, in that sense, has never been a kind of free, liberating society that you know the Taoists certainly thought of. So, in some sense, I think, yeah, there's a tendency that, you know, as I said, you know, with Marxism, I kind of like Marx, but when I harden into the, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat, then the dictator says, "Oh, this is pretty damn good. let's not dissolve the dictatorship, right? I mean, like, the good life is with you. Why should you give it up?" I think that's where the problem is. You know, I think I might have had good intentions to begin with, but you know, once you get into it, you're in the ruling class. Oh, why the hell you want to give it up? I mean, you might have fought the Great War to get to there, and now you might even justify, like, oh, you know, I fought for this, I deserve this, you know, I should get it. So I think that's the problem, is that, you know, it doesn't remain fluid enough for it to, how should I say, blossom and grow in the way it's supposed to be, because it's like, yeah, I just get the feeling that we're more and more entering into society where we are, you know, channel into, I don't want to quite say it this harsh, but I'll say it, channel into the slaughterhouse. And we don't know it, you know. I mean, I think even for cattle and for pigs, you know, if you treat them right, things are good, you know. I remember somebody say, you know, I think it's, what is it? Ernest Hemingway, who says, things always go slowly and slowly, and then it happens all of a sudden. That's because things have a way of developing that you don't notice, and then suddenly it happens, and it's like, you think, well, that's a black swan. No, it is not a black swan. It had been developing in that tension, and suddenly it falls apart. So be careful when you're thinking you're living in a steady state and things are going pretty smoothly. The economy might be going down slightly, but you know, it's pretty stable. Just wait for that when it goes over the waterfall. You know, suddenly it happens, you know. It's kind of like the story. I love this story. Like, somebody is fallen off like an 80-story building, and partway down, somebody says, "How is it going?" "Good so far."
Right. So far, so good.
Yeah. Things are fine so far. In fact, it's kind of fun. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Appreciate it. Rob asked a question in the chat. So, this series it's about a series of installments in a column that was published in a magazine called the Comics Journal. The column was called End Times, and that was the choice of the publisher and not of philosopher Kenneth Smith. He wanted to call it Millennia and Microcosm, but they thought End Times was a more dramatic name. So you can still, if you search around, you can still find the hard copy, but you don't need to, because David Roel scanned the whole thing up onto that website. Those are all scans directly out of the magazine. I have all the magazines downstairs. That was that was how I learned about Kenneth Smith, not through this column, but through one of his earlier columns in the back of of the Comics Journal, years and years, decades ago. And what David and I are doing is we're running this seminar series to have these discussions with all of you all about the content. And as we do, we're taking, you know, lots of notes, and that will go into the publication of a book. We're gonna collect all of this together in a book, give it footnotes, indexes, bibliographies, and you know, Kenneth will write a new intro to it, and then it will be available in fresh hard copy. But the website is certainly true to the way that it was published back in the years 98, 99, 2000. So, Stephen, what's on your mind?
Well, it's just going with that dichotomy again of looking back on the other guy's ideas, whether it was in the past or something, and saying they're silly. It's, oh, well, you know, the Christians were there sitting in their scriptoriums in the Middle Ages and thinking, oh, those Greeks and Romans, their tales about the gods were just so silly. Now, I imagine God's a rather sensible sort of a fella. He'll be sitting in a scriptorium just like me, thinking about rational plans for the universe. And it gets down to David Miller notices this, and somehow it's lost on the atheists when, you know, the atheists are saying, oh, you know, all those Christian legends about the creation of the universe, they just say, silly. You know, God was there, and he goes, sir, you know, over in a 6-day plan with 1 day off. That's just so silly. And David would go, well, what's your explanation? And the atheist will go, well, you see, it all started off, the universe was this tiny little thing which didn't have any space. In fact, sort of like nothing existed. And then everything appeared out of nothing. And, you know, David Miller would say, that sounds like quite a few mythologies I've come across, actually. Yeah, it's just this weird dichotomy that this guy, one guy's saying, well, my ideas are sensible, my ideas are rational. The other guy, he's silly, without being able to reflect on their own ideas being silly to somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So let's go back to the text. I love that, by the way, but let's go back to the text. So I only got us through the first half of the sentence, but you know, when we were saying myths reveal oblique and difficult truths about human nature, where we talked about the way that this is in contrast to the previous sentence, where he's talking about it revealing the forms of order of nature, the nature around us. So now we're looking at the amphibious view, where the myth is trying to connect the nature within us to the nature around us in a way that makes sense of them, that we can see why we are the way we are, why the world is the way it is. And as a result of both of those things, what should we do? What should we be watching for? What should we be careful about? That's the purpose of mythology. As he finishes up this sentence by saying, and about the peculiar warpage that specific appetites and ambitions lay upon human intelligence. So, in other words, in talking about human nature, a big part of what it's trying to talk about is the ways in which we don't see the nature around us clearly, or even the nature within us. We don't see that clearly either, but we see it in a warped way. And that those warpages are not some sort of just generic, general purpose, okay, everybody makes mistakes, but rather that our desires and our plans both warp our perception. You know, the reason he's using this pair, appetites and ambitions, again, this is mimicking gnosis and noesis, the unconscious and the conscious, the emotional or experiential and the rational, mythos and logos, right? And he's saying both the things that we want and the things that we think, both of them are warpages. Now, from a modern perspective, this can't possibly be right, because to be an intellectual, to be rational, is to see the world the way it actually is, right? We align objective and subjective by saying that the rational is objective and the emotional is subjective. This is our argument. This is core to modernity, is this idea that if we could just be computers and have no feelings at all, we would be 100% accurate. And it's, you know, all the bad things in the world happen because of feelings. If only people didn't have any, everything would be great. But, you know, this ancient perspective, which he's alluding to here, with the dangerous things that myth is trying to teach us not to overlook, include that not only our appetites and our feelings, but also our ambitions and plans and ideas are a source of distortion. Both of our faculties are distorting. I mean, that's as contra-modern a statement as you could make anywhere, that we cannot have a pure, perfect objective lens. We don't get to be prophets of the truth who just speak for nature. And Built into this is this idea, talking humility has been brought up a few times. Built into this is this idea that whenever, and it happens all the damn time, whenever moderns claim to be, oh, I don't have any feelings here, I'm just saying how it is. I'm just trying to say what's true. Every time they do that, they're putting on a crown and claiming that I'm nature and I'm now narrating the truth, which of course, this is saying it's impossible for a human being to do. I mean, if it were possible for a human being to do this, we wouldn't need science, for example. I mean, half the reason for science to exist is to tether our ideas to experience, to conduct experiments, which will give us the experience to put our ideas into the crucible and find out which perfectly rational, reasonable, popular ideas are complete bullshit. No matter how much we love those ideas, they're still not true because nature doesn't bear them out. This tethering gets to the heart of what Heraclitus talks about when he talks about, the hidden harmony is the result of tying opposites together in such a way that their forces push off against each other and create a dynamic system, like a bow, an arrow, or like a heart. And of course, the allusion there is also to the way that all of our own biological systems work the same way. Something to speed up our heartbeat, something to slow down our heartbeat, something to increase our blood sugar, something to reduce our blood sugar, something to increase our blood pressure, something to reduce our blood pressure. Every system, in order to stay alive, it can't just be a balancing act or a compromise. It has to be a dynamic system in which you tether opposites together so that they push off against each other. And now you've got the springiness that's necessary to allow you to reach, but to return. And so in this pair, appetites and ambitions, gnosis and noesis, we're talking about a tethering together so that the mutual flaws of our two sets of mental faculties can offset each other, so that our noesis can critique our gnosis. Our gnosis can critique our noesis. If we may have a fabulous idea for the world, but we feel bad every time we think about it, and maybe it's because it's actually a rotten idea. It's like, yeah, it's internally coherent, but we shouldn't do that anyway. Or maybe there's something that we really like, but when we actually do an analysis of it, intellectual, rational analysis, we discover that it's actually bad for us. And it's too bad that we like that. We really shouldn't, because that's going to lead us astray. Each of the faculties can, if they're tethered together correctly, act as a corrective for the other one. And that this is the model of the mind that the ancients have. And that part of the purpose of myth is to teach us about that function and how it can be created within us. And one of the ways that they teach us is through negative examples, by showing us people who let their feelings run away with them and the catastrophes that happen, but also show us people whose ideas ran away with them and catastrophe followed. And by seeing both sets, we come to realize that neither of these faculties, again, contra modern, against the modern perspective, one of these faculties is not the source of all virtue and the other the source of all vice. They are both the source of potential for virtue and potential for vice. But if we want more virtue than vice, if we want more than a roll of the dice, the only hope is to harness them together. Thus the myths. Now, this is the sort of thing that, how would you prove this? I mean, if I was trying to write a logical syllogism to prove any of this, I couldn't do it, because I'm dealing in the mind, and it's that murky area. Science is making so much better progress on physics and chemistry, material science, and even surgery, than it is on the mind and why people do the things that they do. The murky, paradoxical level we talked about earlier in this, the deep, mysterious, obscure layer of reality is somehow hidden in the world outside of us, and yet foregrounded in the world inside of us. You can hardly scratch the surface of trying to understand another human being before suddenly you're into paradoxes and murk and I'm not sures and so forth. So, if you wanted to teach people to do this thing with their mind that would allow them to be healthier, you're not going to be able to do it through a logical syllogism. You can't prove any of this, but you can tell stories. You can tell stories about what happened to different people who had different life strategies, and we can all immerse ourselves in the experience of that story and learn from it, just like we experience the world around us. And then we can walk away with a wisdom that would have been very painful indeed to have had to learn in our own life, but instead we can get it from the life of this character who went through this difficulty. And of course, that's why the Greeks have us call them characters. They are not just personages within a story, they are illustrations of human character to teach us about the limits and liabilities of human nature. And that's what he's talking about in this sentence. This is the second half of the amphibious life. It's not enough to know the world around us. We have to know the world inside of us. Otherwise, we can't choose what to do with any kind of success. Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have something to say about this. It's very important. It really happened to me. You know, when I went to college, I fell in love with the college experience. Because high school was okay, you know, I'm not going to complain about it. It was like you learn the typical things, you know, as best you could. But when I got to college, what happened was I just was fascinated that so many people were interested in things in such a deep manner, the things I would never even consider that was interesting. And I just was fascinated by the openness of that. It's just really opened the multidimensionality that allowed me to become more cosmopolitan in a certain way, right? The diversity of people who have passions in things like bugs, like, God, like, why are you interested in that? I mean, all sorts of things. And I said, oh, you know, yeah, and they have a right to do that, and that's fine, you know. And I remember when I was a sophomore, I finally decided to take one of those vocational tests just to check on myself in a way, you know, about what I'm majoring in is fine. And when I got it back, you know, I really said, oh, this is actually pretty much right on, you know, because, you know, like art, music, you know, philosophy, you know, things of that sort. All of the humanities, I was deeply interested. I scored very high in it. I mean, to a very degree, but certainly very high. In fact, I score higher in music than I was in art. And but then I looked to the bottom, the ones I was not interested in. And I remember I said, uh-oh. Anything has to do with money, I was not interested in. Like finance, you know, accounting, business, whatever, you know, of that sort. And I said, this is going to be a problem. But talking about the relationship between the world and yourself, I wasn't going to prevent myself from pursuing what I wanted to do. But I somehow have the sense that I had more control of myself than I have control of the world. And it became kind of important for me. Oh, I'm going to pursue this. I knew it was a very difficult task. I'm going to tell another part of the story to splice into this. I remember, you know, maybe about a dozen years ago, I was talking to my sister and she was saying about kids these days. And then I went along and chimed with her about, you know, like the fact is they expect things to be done for them and all that. You know, of course, I came up with a very difficult life. And so, you know, and I was sort of complaining how kids of this type was expected everybody to win a trophy, that kind of stuff. And she said, oh, yeah, right. You're talking this way. Like, what the hell did you ever do? You know, that was this. And it just occurred to me, I suddenly remember, oh, yeah. I remember I was so in love with music and I was so very, very poor that it took me 2 years to save the money to buy a record player. 2 years. Many, many days went without eating. That was a sacrifice I made. And, you know, when I said that, she knew she lost the argument because that was some sacrifice. Because once you understand, and I'm not going to put down your passions because, you know, like just go the easy route. You have to identify your passions. You have to understand, like, how much do I want my passions? How much am I willing to sacrifice for it? Because the world is not going to say, oh yeah, you love that? Great. Here's a fellowship that'll help you. Once in a while that happens, but not most of the time. And I grew up, I say this and people are just astonished by this, that I was fortunate I was very poor. You know, it's like, that's the stupidest thing to say, you know, weren't you like inhibited? Yes, I was. But I was able to survive, and I sort of maybe had some confidence in the fact that I could survive, because if things got really bad, I could go through it somehow, right? And so I was willing to also cut to the bones if it's necessary for things I love. And so that was a very difficult task. I think that you should go with your passions, but be very, very careful to remember, there's that part. Do you have the will and the fortitude? And this, by the way, that was all taught to me by when I went to wrestling, I became a wrestler. The fortitude to go through the hardship to get to the point you want. Otherwise, you're going to think that you're going to be an artist, and God, I have to have my latte every morning. That's what I just blew my mind when I was in a group, and I said, you guys don't have any understanding of what doing art in a serious manner really is. Yes, you could have your latte if you're a Sunday painter, fine, no problem, right? If you're going to be serious an artist, you in many ways are challenging the system, you know? So I think, by all means, understand yourself, understand your passion, but understand your limitations and understand your willingness to sacrifice things that you think you could not sacrifice if you want it. And also know when it's time to give up. Like, oh, I've gone too far. Now it's time to get that job at the grocery store clerk. I mean, you got to have that plan to say, yeah, I finally lost. I'm going to settle for just being alive and maybe paint on Sundays or whatever. But I have to finally get the check to pay the rent. If you don't have that in mind, you know, how much you're willing to sacrifice and want to give up the fight, then you could just forget even go on, because it became a lot harder than even I thought. So you got to be willing to do that. And if you're born rich, you may not understand how difficult it might be. You do have an advantage, though, that your mom and dad will kick in some money to support you. So, okay, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. So let's go back to the text, see how far we can get in the remaining 50 minutes. I'm going to go into the next sentence, but first I want to draw our attention back to the opening of this sentence. Myths reveal oblique and difficult truths. So oblique follows naturally from what we were saying before, when we were saying that there's a layer of the order of the cosmos that doesn't lend itself to rational analysis because it's full of contradictions, full of paradoxes. It's too many things are related to too many other things. It's hard to isolate things and experiment on them in isolation. They're connected to everything. You get down to the level of free will versus determinism, for example, as a sample question that's down in the murky zone, and it just seems like you can get whatever answer out of it you want to, depending on what you start out with as your assumptions and how you construct the experiment. It's difficult. So in one sense, when he uses the adjective difficult here, oblique and difficult truths, that's part of what he means. It's being used as a synonym for oblique. It's hard to get access to these truths. You have to go roundabout, and you still may not get. But he means something else too, right? You remember that this is the guy who loves the Nietzsche quote that says, "I want to say in 10 sentences what someone else says in a book, what someone else does not say in a book." You know, he's trying to find ways to do what Heraclitus did and pack multiple meanings. So he means difficult two different ways, and one of them is the way I just said. The other way in which he means difficult is difficult for us to accept. difficult for us to want to hear, truths that we would rather not acknowledge. And of course, part of the challenge in human epistemology is that one of the greatest powers of the human mind is the ability to erase from our consciousness anything we would rather not deal with. We have these powers. Freud made his list of the defense mechanisms of the mind, and he put both repression and suppression. And you could shove things down in your mind and say, I'd rather not deal with that. You can consciously do that, but you've got a whole other defense mechanism called repression, which is where your conscious mind wasn't even involved. Your unconscious mind says, nope, we're not going to deal with that either. And down it goes, and you never even knew you did it. Right? The ability to make things drop out of our field of awareness so effectively that they might as well not exist for us. That ability is a potent reflex in Homo sapiens. And we've talked about the reasons why that's true. We somehow have to fit an infinite cosmos into a finite span of attention, and it isn't going to fit. So it is the natural, ordinary, second-by-second operation of gnosis to suppress almost everything that's happening around us and draw our attention to the handful of things we're capable of thinking about at one time. So in that process, in a healthy person, a Nietzschean Übermensch, right? The way that process would work would be that our unconscious always brings to our attention the thing we most need to attend to, right? That would be the healthiest work relationship between gnosis and noesis. But that's not what we find. We find all these warpages, all these distortions, in which our unconscious becomes a conspirator, a co-conspirator in not drawing to our attention things that we probably really should be attending to, but that it would rather not deal with. The repression, classic example of that. You never even got the chance to choose. It just vanished out of your awareness. And so whenever there's things that, whenever we go through trauma, and of course we've all gone through a lot of trauma in our lives, and they become parts of our life or the experience of the world that make us uncomfortable and we'd rather not deal with, too often our unconscious plays games with us and prevents important topics related to that from coming up into our consciousness. To just stay in the unconscious, even though it would be healthy to notice them. We can't notice them. They're difficult in this case, not just because they're hard to express or to reason about, but they're difficult because we don't want to deal with them. And one of the key places that comes up, Kenneth Smith deals a lot with these issues from Kierkegaard about, the nature of delusions, the nature of ideologies, the nature of worldviews and perspectives, in which he says a delusion is a state of mind in which the thing you most desperately need to be able to think about to escape the delusion is exactly the thing the delusion won't let you notice or think about. That's how a delusion, that's the definition of a delusion. It's not an error. It is a self-reinforcing error that can make it seem like there's no error occurring. It's just editing the world so that all roads lead back into the worldview you already have. And of course, that's what this whole book is about, trying to get out of that trap. So other examples of difficult truths are not just things that are hard to express and not just things you personally don't want to know about, but things that your existing worldview with its suite of ideologies and delusions would rather were not true or were not so. And so your brain automatically, unconsciously reinterprets those things in a way that makes them not offensive to the worldview, not challenge the worldview, not rupture the envelope, right? To keep it intact so that you can't see beyond it, so that you can't see there even is an envelope. These are the real difficulties. This is where the two faculties of the mind really become demonic in their capacity to delude us. They consciously and unconsciously together are able to lay the tracks of our minds, so they always seem to circle back into thinking that we more or less are seeing things the way that they should be seen. More or less, we must be valuing things the way that they actually should be valued, and so forth. Difficult, right? This goes beyond slippery or offensive or hard to express. This is fighting against our own mind's function when it tries to reinforce its worldview at the expense of reality. So that sets us up for the sentences to follow. His next sentence is, myths are maps of the covert currents of the implicit world, the subjective forces to which human beings are liable. So now he's just sort of summarizing what he said before, right? That effectively, if you look at a collection of rich myths, not the shallow stuff like, you know, so-and-so turned into a bird and that's why this bird flies over this bay, not that kind of stuff, but the stuff that is, you know, why did Oedipus make the mistakes that he did? Why? Why was this his fate? What is the relationship between his character and this outcome? That's the deeper stuff, right? That's trying to, as he says here, it's trying to map out how the currents of the mind work, not only for us, but also against us. Because poor Oedipus, all he wanted was to not kill his dad. And so he ran away from the guy that wasn't his dad, who he thought was his dad. And he ran towards the guy who he thought wasn't his dad, who was his dad. And that's how he ended up in the wrong place. If his own best impulses became his weapon against himself, that was wielded by fate, the fate of his character and what he knew and didn't know and how he dealt with things. So, you know, the level at which myths become meaningful in this Greek sense is not the level at which they're just entertaining stories or that they're lies, but the level at which they begin to map out for us the terrain of our own character. What is human nature? What are its limits and liabilities? Where its strengths? You know, what should we be striving for? And what are its weaknesses that we have to be aware of in ourselves and watch out for? And the fact that he talks about it not just as a covert terrain, but as covert currents is important here, because, you know, the modern idea is that we are active and the information we have is passive. Right? We have the model that the body is a machine and the brain is a computer, and therefore everything you learn just goes into a little memory register, and it doesn't harm anybody or alter anything. It just sits there waiting for us to act on it. But the ancient worldview is that everything is an organism, including ideas. So the facts are not facts. They're organisms of the mind. And when you're dreaming, and when you're not doing anything with them, they themselves are busy in there making connections, creating meaning with or without your permission, pulling you along and trying to reconcile themselves with what you already know to create a new hybrid worldview that's a mix of what you thought you knew before the idea and what your unconscious can make of it now that it's got this idea added to the mix. And the result of that is that, you know, this is underscoring the man with the hammer warning, which is the moment you pick up a hammer, you start to see every problem as a nail. That there is no such thing as a passive instrument that you can apply your will to without being changed by it. The man who picks up a hammer becomes a carpenter. He's not the same person he was before he picked the hammer up. And it's the same with every idea we pick up. They change us, and they squirm around in the dark in their little biological ways, and they form networks and implications such that when we try to reason about the world, we find ourselves sliding along these paths drawn by these currents that were hidden from us, covert, hidden from us. We didn't even know that was going on in our brain. And it's happening because there is a physics and a nature of the implicit world, the subjective world within us, that's every bit as important for determining what we do as the objective world that we can point to and measure and, you know, put names to outside of us. And matching the two and showing their relationships is the only way to understand why things end up the way that they do with human beings. And it's the only way, and this goes back to Heraclitus again, it's only through cultivating, through working in this covert implicit landscape that we begin to be able to create a small space of genuine freedom for ourselves. Until we start treating our feelings and our ideas with skepticism, and not a vague skepticism of, I suppose I could be wrong about something, but actual, you know, intense skepticism of, I know you're busy in there, but I don't know what you're up to. And I'm going to try to find out what you're doing in there, squirming around in the dark when I'm asleep. What are you up to? You know, until we get into that, we basically don't have any freedom at all. until we start to take responsibility for what those things are doing inside of us and how they're changing us and making some things seem obvious and some things seem unthinkable, until we engage with that and take responsibility for it, Kenneth Smith and this existentialist tradition and the Greeks would argue, we are just symptoms of our culture and personality. Disposable, interchangeable. Because we don't even know what's happening in us. So it's like we're sleepwalking. Whereas we're as relevant, our will is as relevant to determining, the outcomes of things as a sleepwalker is wandering through a political discussion and thinking that they're having a dream about dancing. It's like, nothing is happening the way that they think it's happening. You have to figure out what's going on before you can make intelligent choices about it. So, Sharon asks about the practical side of things from time to time. And this is where we're starting. It's the middle of this paragraph where we're starting to get to the part that Kenneth is trying to say about the way that the Greeks see myth. The practical side of myth is, without myth, you don't have any freedom of choice. You're just being your actions are being determined by the mix of your ideologies that you subscribe to and your patterns of feeling and temperament that you have. But with myth, you can begin the process of understanding the meaning of those internal structures and how they relate to the external structures. And you can begin to understand the possibility that you could take responsibility for all of that. Instead of ignoring it and denying it, you could take responsibility for it and start cultivating it and start changing it. And then and only then do you start to have some freedom, because now you're actually actively making choices about who you want to become. Right? Instead of just being the next domino in the row. This is the practical purpose of myth from the Greek perspective. I'm going to call on Phil in a second, but again, I just want to reiterate what I said at the beginning of today's call, which is, but our challenge is you can hardly say the word myth in a modern context without it seeming to be a lie. And what would be the practical purpose of a lie? Some kind of deception? It's like, it is very hard to talk about these things because the reflex to want to reinterpret myth, not as the Greeks do, as a map of these covert currents, but as moderns do, as some kind of deception, is so reflexive in us. It's so natural. It's so ingrained that you can hardly finish a sentence before your brain is trying to turn back to the modern definition. And that just murks up the waters, and then it's impossible to figure out what we're talking about. Phil, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, that's really a tough ask. Okay, and I'll try to explain it in that sense. I've always doubted the scientific doubt. Because the scientific doubt is one has a hypothesis, and then one is going to try to disprove. Because let's pretend and doubt that it's true, and try to disprove it. And I think that's, to me, it's only partly there, but it's kind of shallow because it just peels off the surface structure. And I want to use the metaphor that I used, I think last time when I studied with this Chinese guy about Chinese, and then he was explaining the language, and he mispronounced the concept of sentences when he got the interrogative. He said interrogative. Okay, I want to focus on the interrogative aspect of the interrogative. Imagine, of course, one of the things about doubt is that the deepest aspect is you have to begin to doubt yourself. Okay, so now imagine you're interrogating yourself, and you're sitting in a three-legged stool. And of course, they're asking you questions, nothing is surfacing. So they bring in the lights, shining it on you, making you sweat, all sorts of things, getting very, very intense. Okay, so far that's good. That's about yourself, interrogating yourself, self-doubt. I don't think I've ever gotten to the point where I came around when it got really tough. The guy kicks one of the legs out of the stool and say, Phil, how do you feel now? Right? That's a tough ask. The reason why that's a tough ask is I understand the equivocal relationship between doubt and representation. But that's equivocal for a reason, because you have to exist also with some sort of stability in order to even be able to doubt. So when suddenly somebody kicks the stool, which you sit on, that's like killing the turtle that holds up the earth, right? I mean, it is like, maybe it's too much of an ask because it asks you to, in a sense, to call in Shiva. And I'm not sure that I'm willing to have Shiva come along, you know, like waving his drumstick, and it's like getting kind of ready. That's a really, really tough ask because you're knocking off the leg, the psychological leg that you depend on to even be able to ask questions. So, yeah, I understand that. On one hand is where you need to be to truly get to the other side. But so much of your even ability to exist in the world and cope with the world in a way is that you depend on the third leg of the stool. And to ask that is essentially to ask, like, believe in the resurrection, right? Maybe I'm too grounded on being in the world. I don't know, but it's like, there are people who did that, you know? The people who went with, what is it, James Jones down to Guyana or whatever, and they poisoned themselves, right? I guess maybe they didn't go through doubt, but they believe. Like, I probably would have said, well, wait a minute. This time you've gone too far. I'm not so sure. Okay, so I'd rather that if it became that it came in small doses so I could handle it, you know, maybe took an inch off one leg, inch off another leg, and then slowly get to the point like you're finally off the stool. But you're asking a really, really, I even doubt that what's his name that wrote this has kicked the stool under his own leg under his own stool. That's why I got to say that, you know, there's an interdependency there that's hard to go that far where you question your own psychological existence.
That's right. That's right. It's tough. I mean, there's a reason why the metaphor is Sisyphus rolling a boulder uphill for all eternity. It never gets to stop. It's just, you know, always going to be hard. But in real life, none of us can do that. We're not a demigod like Sisyphus, who had divine blood in him, right? We're mortals. And since we're mortals, we can only work on pushing the boulder uphill sometimes. And the rest of the time, we got a life to live. And part of it is not just about rest and recovery, although that's part of it, but part of it is, you know, from traditional Okinawan martial arts, you can only progress so fast because you need time to make your mistakes so that later you can catch yourself making them and recognize them and go, oh yes, this is what I do. And now I know that it's wrong. I can start fixing it. But before you spend the time making the mistake, you don't have anything to point to. And if you only did it once or twice, you wouldn't recognize it as intrinsic to the way you practice. It's only when you've been doing it a lot that you can spot it. So there is an interplay between the philosophical part of life and simply living life that's necessary. It can't all be one all the time.
Well, not only an interplay, but you also have responsibilities. Remember the myth I told you about Hercules meeting Atlas? I mean, Atlas found how a good life is, but when Hercules finally walked away, I mean, I guess Atlas could just pout and just drop the ball, right? But he was burdened with a responsibility, like, oh God, this is the cross I have to carry, you know. But so there's something just beyond you too, that somehow exists. So, you know, like, oh yeah, now I see the truth. You know, Zeus can't rule over me. I'm gonna just drop the ball and leave. You know, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
As well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, it's an excellent point to bring up. And it's why Kenneth Smith uses the metaphor of gaining that self-awareness, you know, through mythos, gaining that self-awareness of how your mind works and what your limits and liabilities are, and how fragile any reliable human epistemology really is. And frankly, any reliable human axiology really is. How much, you know, work it takes to try to figure out what's real, and how much incredible work it takes to try to figure out what's good, what should we be doing. He likens it to, you know, dislocating the joint of the mind so that it can move in a direction it was never designed to move, to look back upon itself. And only then do you become conscious of yourself and what you're doing. He's describing it as a painful and unnatural act. You know, he's with you, Phil. He's like, you can't spend all your time doing this, you know. Other times he has to go paint paintings. You know, take a bath, eat a meal, have a nap. It's the human state, right? We're finite. We can only deal with this stuff at a finite level. So on with the text, right? We got another half hour to go. We can get further. Before I go to the next sentence, I want to reiterate part of the previous sentence. Myths are maps of the covert currents of the implicit world, this world, the subjective forces to which human beings are liable. Not some human beings, not weak human beings, not bad human beings. He means human beings are liable. And this is where you can, and I know Stephen gets a little chuckle from his interactions with, you know, ultra-rationalists. This is where you can get a little chuckle, because an ultra-rationalist is somebody who thinks they are exempt from this, that they are mostly rational. And occasionally they make a mistake, you know, and a little bit of that irrationalism might slip out, but then they stomp on it and it goes away, and now they're back to being 100% rational. And the reason I know this is I was a rationalist. Yeah, my dad's an ultra-rationalist. I was an ultra-rationalist for a while. I know exactly what it's like to live through this. And I've been in, you know, endless discussions with ultra-rationalists, both on their side and against them. I know what the self-image looks like. And the way that the self-image works is that you think you're a Vulcan. You know, you grew up watching Star Trek, and that was a mistake, because now you think you're Spock. And you think that, you know, but even in Star Trek, we see that Spock struggles with his emotions because he's only half Vulcan. And the implication is for us to learn that as human beings, we have an even more intense struggle with those things. And it's going on all the time. And as psychology teaches us, that bounty of feelings and unconscious experiences is bigger than our conscious mind. And this is the thing that an ultra-rationalist doesn't want to hear. They're like, no, that's just dirt I built my castle upon. All the important things happen in the castle, says the ultra-rationalist. And the myth, the Greek myth and the Greek perspective says that's not true. All human beings are liable to these subjective forces created by these covert currents within the implicit world of their mind. And that the authority, the power of those currents is at a divine level, which is why Aphrodite is a goddess, right? Among equals, right? I mean, the god of war has no more power over you. War has no more power over you than your feelings of attraction. They are every bit as potent. You know, all that stuff that's going on inside of us in that covert level is so potent as to be defining. It's the fingerprints of our character. And so we're all liable to it. And this is why you can distinguish between true science and ultra-rationalist science. Ultra-rationalist science talks about it as though they're building up a perfect crystalline structure of indisputable laws from which we can now logically deduce all truths about the universe. But a real scientist says, no, the entire edifice of this thing is built upon the limits and liabilities of human reason, and that we must put our ideas to the test. We must give the world the chance to disprove them. We have to, because we are far too easily persuaded by the things we want to hear. And the things we don't want to hear have far too hard a time persuading us. Our thumbs are firmly on the scales, and it's only when we put our ideas to the test that we discover the presence of our thumb on the scale. And go, who's doing that? Is that me? Oh no, because now the results don't come out the way we thought that they would, the way that we insisted that they should before we ran the experiment. So, you know, we have to address the real power that these subjective forces have over us. And myths will do that. The Greek myths, you know, the ancient definition of myths, that kind of myth will do that. It will make us squarely face the structure of our mind in a way that's not as flattering, but is perhaps more useful to understand what we can and can't expect to accomplish with our minds. So that sets us up for the next sentence. Emotions and passions are ultimately manias or states of possession. And he means demon here, right? The pun from the Heraclitean daimon to the Christian demon that possesses you, that's what he's referring to here. In which human beings lose their customary powers of self-rule. We talked about self-rule in, I think, section B, I can't remember. Autarkia, self-rule. That is to not be a passive object, and also not just to be a clockwork mechanism, but to be able to rule over yourself and make meaningful choices in your life. To be able to, you know, unlike the stone that has to lie there and get wet, you can, like the cat, get up and walk out of the rain and go find yourself somewhere dry to be. You can change your circumstances. And to be, you know, to have self-rule, you have to also be aware of the weather inside of you and be able to get up and move and not just lie there and suffer your feelings like a state of possession. And so, you know, it's powerful to read about the wrath of Achilles and how possessed he was with outrage, that he couldn't do what was best, not only for the Greeks generally, but even for himself. He was just too offended. It took him over. I mean, the whole Iliad is just a fraction of the story of the Trojan War. And it is that fraction that's about the wrath of Achilles. It's all about this very subject, how this state of possession determined the course of the war, changed the course in huge ways. I mean, just spectacular, which, you know, as the Greeks are arguing, changed the course of history, you know, for I don't know, 800, 900 years in the Mediterranean. The one thing about this that I'd caution you is that I think, you know, this is one of those rare moments where I think Kenneth has slightly missed his target, because I know that he doesn't just mean emotions and passions. He also means ideologies and delusions. He's always, except in this opening sentence, everywhere else in this chapter and everywhere else in this book, he's always talking about how either one of the core faculties of the mind, the basal metabolic functions of the mind, either one can be a source of mania or state of possession. So your gnosis can capture you with immersion and experience. Your feelings become too strong. Your perceptions become too strong. You know, you know, what you're passionate about becomes too strong. But your noesis is every bit as capable of being a mania or state of possession, in which you're obsessed with the logic of your understanding of the world. And this is what Hannah Arendt writes about in The Origins of Totalitarianism, when she says that people living outside of totalitarian systems, rationalists living outside of totalitarian systems, always want to blame totalitarianism on irrationality. Oh, they let themselves be contaminated by discrimination. Oh, they let themselves be contaminated by rage or anger. She says, but that's not it at all, she says. It's the opposite of that. What they let themselves be contaminated with was logic. If the logic says we have to purify our race, well then, I guess we have no choice but to exterminate the Jews, say the Nazis. They let themselves follow the chains of logic of this abstract and distorted understanding of the world. And that leads them into things that defy the logic of the world, the actual logic of the world, not the logic of human beings. It leads them into conflict with the world. And it does it because they refuse to let experience override the logic of their ideology, right? This is like ideas without science. And she describes the same thing happened under Stalinism with the purges. Why so many deaths? Well, the logic of the ideology demanded it. And yeah, it feels bad. Human beings, as the Nazis noted, have a tendency to have mental breakdowns when they're forced to exterminate people. It feels wrong to be doing this, but they were faithful to their logic. The delusion had them in a state of possession, and they followed it to the bitter ends. And it was only when they lost power that other people could point and say, by the way, I don't care if your delusion says you had to do that. You are not a helpless pawn. You are responsible for the things that you do, even if you are possessed by a political system or an ideology or a favorite theorem or a brilliant mathematical proof. Whatever it is that's got you, you shouldn't be a slave to it any more than you should be a slave to addiction or to attraction or to anything else. And he structured this in the Greek way. To be more alive is to have more self-rule. To be less alive is to have less self-rule, less autarkia. A stone has almost no autarkia. It's just passive. Its self-rule is mostly restricted to being what it is, to the extent that it can resist the erosive forces that will eventually grind it down to sand. But that's about it. A plant has more self-rule than that. An animal has more self-rule than that. A human being has the potential for more self-rule than that, but only if we become self-aware and take responsibility for cultivating our character. And of course, in the system of cosmology of the ancient world, above human beings are the gods, who effectively have complete self-rule over themselves, except in that they must continue to express the aspect of nature that they express and in its lawfulness. But other than that, they have levels of self-rule that we can only envy, because we are so prone by these covert currents within us to being in a state of mania or possession. And that, says Heraclitus, is in fact our normal state. That's not something that happens once in a while if we're unlucky. Heraclitus says the normal state of people is as though they are walking around asleep. Instead of attending to the shared intelligence of the cosmos, the logos, the rules, the laws of nature, the deep hidden harmony, we're busy attending to our inner passions, our inner emotions, and our inner, logics and ideologies, our legal systems, the social ladders we want to climb, the economic systems we want to, win in, and so forth. All these things possess us and prevent us from dealing with the world the way it actually is. And of course, that's just the first half of the sentence, because the second half is to say that this is the point of mythology. This is the thing that myths can do that logic has a tough time with. Understanding this level of human existence and its relationship to the world around us is so meta. You know what I mean? It's outside the normal frame of reference that we're talking in terms of. It's the frame of reference about the frame of reference. It's so meta that it's hard to think about and hard to talk about in a strictly logical, mathematical way. But myths do a great job. He said myths tell the naive about the ways of those fantastic and obscure inner teleologies, the directions, the drives that comprise human nature. I mean, once you've seen Oedipus do what he did in Oedipus Tyrannus, you're not going to forget it anytime soon. Once you see Achilles lose his fucking mind, pardon my French, when he discovers that Patroclus is dead, he loses his mind and he does the most offensive things possible, dragging poor Ajax's body around and around the walls of Troy until he's just a bloody wreck of rags. Is to a modern, it's hard to understand what an obscenity that was to the Greeks. Respect for the dead was like the cornerstone of why the Greek tribes didn't turn on each other and kill each other. We will respect, your ways of honoring your dead, you will respect our ways of honoring our dead, and thus we can coexist side by side and we don't disintegrate into just, slaughtering one another. What Achilles did threatened the entire basis of Greek civilization in that moment. But that's how out of control he was. Right? This everything had led to this moment when he was going to completely lose it and be so possessed that he couldn't remember anything important. It was like even the most important things gone from his head. And if he can forget to do that, then what can we forget to do in our lives when we're in a state of possession? And Heraclitus says, and we're always in a state of possession. And this is the challenge of the human condition. It's why virtue and vice are so commingled in us. Why, heroism and tragedy are so commingled. That it is our natural state to be possessed, either by our gnosis or by our noesis, and either way to take some crazy imbalanced action that's not healthy for us or for the world. This happens all the time. And you might remember some months back, before my big break, I was quoting from this book, Aspects of Death, in early Greek poetry, lyric poetry. And in that she had these brilliant bits where a lot of the things we associate with the philosophers are already being talked about by the poets earlier. And the poets who are trying to share the mythology, right? They're trying to embody the mythos in their writings. And she said, the author says, they saw in mortality, the mortal condition of a human being, not just that we die, as bad as that is, but a total of three, she said. There were three, Emily Vermeule, I think her name is, three great tragedies of mortality, that we die so soon, that none of our creative works survive for long. You'd think, well, maybe I can make up for my death by building a beautiful city or writing a great epic poem, or I'll create these creative works and I'll give them away to the world. And that can be my legacy that outlasts me. But the Greeks have been around long enough to go, yeah, but sooner or later, people lose those books. They get burned in a library or fall into a river and the ink runs, or, the statue there's an earthquake and the statue of Memnon cracks. Or there's a war and the city that you spent all that time designing and building is razed to the ground, and now it's just ruins and rubble and weeds, and there's nothing left of it. So our mortality, yes, our creative works, dear God, Ozymandias by Shelley is always worth rereading to remind ourselves. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. The lone and level sand stretched far away. It's like, where are your works? All I see is sand. But the third, they said, the thing that the Greeks hated most, more than anything about being mortal, they hated it with a flaming passion. They said, is that we're so stupid. They said the most intelligent of us is just being whipped this way and back by these states of possession, by these manias. We wake up every morning and we've forgotten almost everything that we were doing yesterday. It says, like, we're creatures of a day. We have to start over every day. We forget almost everything. And even when we're at the top of our game, our reason is so easily diverted by a delusion or an ideology, or even just, a momentary peckishness, desire for a sandwich. It's like, how can we be so fickle and fragile in our thinking? They said, well, I don't know, but oh my God, it's horrible. To be mortal to the Greeks meant all three of these things at the same time. So what he's talking about here in this two-part sentence, he's talking about this thing that they're most concerned about, that, our intelligence is corrupted by these covert current, by the subjective forces of these covert currents. We're whipped this way and that. And the only chance we have to reduce that down to something less pitiable is to try to learn about ourselves. Learning about ourselves and our character is so hard that it defies the rational mind. It won't obey the law of the excluded middle. It won't obey logical syllogisms. is this murky realm of paradoxes and forces erupting into existence, sometimes seemingly out of nowhere, to quote Phil's Big Bang analogy. And so, you know, we need some other faculty to give us the ability to see into ourselves, that science through microscopes and telescopes and all these other tools has given us the ability to see outside of ourselves. I mean, we can use a microscope to look at a neuron, but we can't use a microscope to look at what the hell was I thinking when I dragged Ajax's body around the walls of Troy 7 times. No microscope is ever going to show me that. And so this is what myth is for. This is the practical purpose of myth, is to try to use stories very carefully in a very intelligent way to map things out in an unforgettable fashion, so that even when we're just throwing a tantrum, somebody can remind us of Achilles throwing a tantrum and we go, oh, yeah, okay, that's embarrassing. We can get control of ourselves because we've been here before, even if it was vicariously through somebody else's life. Sorry, Hector, not Ajax. Why did I say Ajax? Hector, every time I meant to say Hector. It's Achilles dragging Hector's body around the walls. Thank you, thank you. These things, see, this is what I'm talking about. Of course it's Hector. Joseph, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I think actually this is a very good point, because I think one of the things is that if Donald had talked about the idea of wisdom and how that is related to evaluated understanding. And essentially stories give us ideas as to why maybe we're feeling something, that we, you know, there's something in our instincts. Whereas if we were to just purely look at it from maybe I'm feeling this because, and we'll come up with a reason, and it may be your circumstances, but there may be something deeper behind that than your circumstances that's actually driving. And so this is the idea, is cultivating self-knowledge, and this relates to character, is that, and sometimes what stories do is they give you hints as to how to really evaluate yourself and maybe understand your authentic self through a story, and through myths. And so it's not only just the ability to, you know, help us think beyond you know, the empirical world. It's just also, it's this internal it helps us evaluate our internal mechanisms as much as it does our external, as you just said, pretty much said. But it is critical, because as you, in a very practical sense, as you know, as I journal more and more, sometimes I have to think about things outside of my personal experience, and that is that helps you enlighten yourself, and essentially you're evaluating not only your experience, but also you're able to compensate for your limited perspective on the world. And so I think that this is as far as self-knowledge and character building and character formation goes, I think that this is something that's helpful. Anyway.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the project he's up to in this book is it has real practical purpose. You know, it's just really getting to understand how to begin to comprehend what's going on within us. Why do we do the things we do? How can we choose to do other than we do? You know, all of that is dealing with this murky zone that mythos is very good at. I was gonna, you know, mention here a couple of things real briefly. One of them is Hannah Arendt talks about this in The Human Condition, when she says the tragedy of the modern condition is that we're able to do things that we can't understand. And we can do them easily with a push of a button, and yet not know why we did it or what the consequences are. So she says our powers of changing the world have outstripped our powers of understanding the world or ourselves. And she gives examples like, I can't remember if she cites quantum physics, but she talks about, examples from physics and elsewhere where it's only through equations that we're able to model the behavior, and we have no intuition anymore to explain it. And although she's focusing on the outer world, what he's talking about here is the inner world, but it's the same. I mean, he's read Hannah Arendt cover to cover over and over. Obviously, to my reading, obviously with this, he's alluding to Hannah Arendt and this problem of what horrific human condition it puts you into if you don't know why you do the things you do, and you can't even put them into words. It's a form of helplessness far more profound than being in shackles, and that he sees the ancients as believing that mythos was designed to get you out of those shackles. This is to get you out of that state of helplessness, so that you can understand why you're doing the things that you do. What does it mean to be a human being? Why do we do these things? And by knowing that, we get a chance to change our behavior that we wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, until we know that, we think we're doing these things for some other reason, and then our efforts to alter that outcome are pointing in entirely the wrong direction, and so they don't have the result that we expect them to. So, yeah. The second thing I wanted to add here briefly is Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. Recognition is part of the power of gnosis. This unconscious part of ourselves that's always on that myths are trying to teach us to always be on the watch in nature for the actions of the gods. What are the things that we should be attending to in nature that we've been ignoring? We can recognize them. Right? The power of recognition in a human being is a powerful thing. It's so powerful and automatic in us that when it goes wrong, like in the Oliver Sacks book, it stands out as just starkly weird, right? Because normally our powers of recognition are so strong that by comparison, our powers of reason are just like a little pinky. It's just trivial. The fact that you can be blindfolded and confused and shaken around and dropped in a street, and the blindfold's taken off, and there's your favorite sandwich shop, and you know exactly where you are. I mean, no matter what they attempted to do, the instant that you recognize something, you're oriented. That power is very old in biological systems. It predates our species by a long way. I mean, maybe a 500 million years of evolution have gone into that. So what myths are doing is getting us to be able to understand our inner world through a process of recognition. I've seen this before. I saw this when Achilles lost his mind. I saw this when Oedipus did the best he could and it all worked out badly. I saw this myth after myth. I recognize these characters and I see myself in them, and thus I'm oriented in a way I never could be if I had to try to reason it out logically. It would have taken too long, was too fragile, too easily distracted by whatever I'm trying to think about right now. It's that unconscious power of recognition. And it should be noted that among the definitions typically cited for gnosis, one of the definitions is recognition. Some people translate gnosis as recognition. And if you read Hegel, you'll find that when he's translating Begriff, one of the most common ways to translate it is as recognition. Now, if you just call it recognition, it's almost incomprehensible what he's trying to say. But if we recognize that recognition is part of it, it's a power of that faculty, then we start to see how all this connects together, why mythos could become a good guide to the psychology of human nature and human character. Rob, go ahead. What's on your mind? Come off mute and tell us what you're thinking about.
Alrighty. It seems like it's unmuted. Yeah, all this is really interesting. I'll try to keep this brief because I know we're nearing the end. But the sort of as you said, so meta, it's hard to commentate on line earlier. Reminds me a lot of that distinction that Heidegger makes between the ontic and the ontological. And it's almost like mythos sort of plays this role to stop like an infinite regress. Kind of reminds me of like how like Aristotle talks about like first principles. Like we need a stopping point for this. We can't just have our this sort of mythical understanding just kind of or like a scientific knowledge of ourselves go back forever and ever and ever. There needs to be sort of a ground for it. And that's sort of like what mythology seems to be playing a role as. And this reminds, sorry to be like dropping names and references and stuff. I'm not trying to seem pedantic, but it does remind me a lot of reminds me a lot of in if we take a sort of theory of mind interpretation of the Republic, this is the role that sort of children would play. And he talks about like telling stories to the people that you're bringing up because they're not ready for, like, I don't know, the complexity of what's actually going on. Yeah, just a very very interesting connection that you're making with the the role that possession and the daemon and our emotional lives, and with the recognition in our sort of like perceiving things in the world that are really abstract forces, is very, very cool. So that's what's on my mind.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, it's part of what's interesting about Kenneth's take on the ancient worldview in this book, but also elsewhere when he talks about it, is that in defying the modern habit of treating the ancients as primitive versions of ourselves, as just having bad science or weak science or poor understanding, by actually trying to explicate how they saw the world, we discovered that their model for like questions for determining free will versus determinism are actually a whole lot more sophisticated than the ones we use in everyday conversation today. I mean, as moderns, we really struggle with the question of free will versus determinism, but the ancients had a simple set of metaphors that allowed for an incredibly sophisticated range of answers once you put it together. And so it's exactly like you're saying, that through the use of storytelling and metaphors, they've managed to create a sort of stable ground that if we can stand there as our Archimedean standpoint, then our reason is more effective. We're able to reason about the world more successfully, beginning from that point. Even if the ground itself is irrational, it's ultimately it's stories and feelings and things. But still, from that perspective, we succeed more often with our reason once we reason from there. So yeah, I think you're right on. I'm sure that's what Kenneth is arguing in part here. And of course, when he's arguing it in this chapter, he's not just saying that's his perspective. He's saying his take is that that's the ancient perspective. That's how they saw the world. Phil, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'm going to tie that to my art, but expand beyond that. But I'll start out with my art. When I was younger, I was avant-garde, certainly a modernist, still a modernist, think of myself, but I was evolving, changing all the time, moving to the next stage. Then when I started painting fallen angels, although there's changes that take place, it was within a certain type of expression. I've told you before about the fallen angels is really about the nature of the fallenness of man. We can't quite handle the truth as it was. And somebody asked me a very important question. He says, I think understanding, however, was previously much more changing in terms of moving ahead to something else. He says, how long are you going to keep painting fallen angels? Right? Meaning that you've sort of stopped progress. And I said, well, that's asking me how long should I continue to pray? Because I think every image of the fallen angels is a prayer for humanity. I think, I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it's because I lived a very poor life and I lived in China and understood the pathos of existence, that there's something tragic and timeless about it. But I'm thinking that maybe specifically at this moment, when it seems like we're arrived at a moment where we can't seem to progress anymore. And I'm thinking then back to the argument between Plato and the poets, right? And the poets were Well, they were writing stories, mythic stories. That was, in some sense, a kind of a drag. They were kind of, they're kind of like tragic, like fallenness. I mean, things are always going wrong. And I could see Plato wanting to be more optimistic, present a thing we actually could get out of this, that this is a technique and so forth. So, kind of hurrah for Plato in one sense. But I think that might be a counter movement. Then I'm thinking about, the famous BBC series with Joseph Borowski was called, produced. You should all watch it. It's called The Ascent of Man. Very, very wonderful story about civilization and mankind. And he's showing step by step how we progress, kind of like the modernist story, like there are setbacks, but essentially we moved along, kind of like Hegel in a sense, that things are getting better. Humanity is becoming more enlightened and, all that kind of stuff. But it was very interesting that the final program was when he went to Auschwitz. And he talked about Auschwitz and all that happened. And then he went to a kind of pond that's next to it, a kind of, not a pond, but kind of like, a swampy place. And he reached into the pond and he brought up what appears to be dirt, but they were ash. And he says, this is the result of our humanity. Right? Talk about a contradiction of the ascent of man. To tell this upward slope and ashes. Like I said, I wrote the article about lobsters, but I said, it's only a short step between blood and soil to blood and ashes. So we have to be careful about our humanity. Yes, there is progress, but there's always these things. The next step might be ashes. And it's the blood and ashes, not ashes and diamonds. Okay, so I think that we have to understand that there is within us, now maybe not you individually, but humanity itself, this inability to extend a kind of humanity, compassion to others, and finally to create a technology that supposedly overcome that, but in fact doubles back upon ourselves. And I am wondering, I'm not wondering this like I'm just falling sleepless nights, but I'm wondering whether we're not approaching close to the last act. I think that already showed itself with the atomic bomb. But I'm wondering whether it is now time for all of us to fall on our knees and pray. Pray not to God, but for our own humanity. That's what my fallen angels is about. I don't know how I got this deep Greek mind on me, but I do. That yes, there are good days, there are bad days, and all that, good days, bad days. But there's a, what do you call it, the sword of Damocles, or a large boulder hanging above us that we are all anxious of. And everybody is very anxious, Some don't know why they're anxious, but everybody is, well, the only way to get out of it is to pop more pills. So just be careful. Be careful of who you are and be careful of others. As compassionate as you could be without, without going way overboard, because you have to also watch out for yourself. That's why I can't stop painting fallen angels. Because maybe I, in my own way, as reaching into the pool and bringing up the ashes and saying, here you go. Watch out. All right. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. And with that, we will.
Now, I've got a message for Donald. I'm President of America. You're my American military. You've got to figure out a plan for me so I can beat the Ruskies. I want that plan, Donald, because we're stuck there at the moment. And those dastardly Chinese with their Belt and Road have come behind my back and are taking all my markets while I'm stuck there. So we've got to get this over soon, Donald. So I'm counting on you.
I don't know, Stephen. We're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. So I don't have a plan.
Hey, Donald, what a sacrifice, willing to fight for the last Ukrainian.
I got that strategy from Chiang Kai-shek. He was willing to fight to the last Chinese, but not him.
Okay, Donald, that's what I like to hear. I'm giving you a promotion.
Oh, God.
It's the best plan I've heard so far. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm off next week, but week after next, we'll pick this up again right where we left off.
All right. So it's not every other week, though. It's not a steady schedule, right?
2 weeks
No,
on.
it's 2 and 1.
Okay, okay. All right, thanks.
All the very best, Rick.
Thank you.
Give Beverly my regards, okay?
Yeah,
I will. I'll tell her.
yeah.
Well, I'm glad I didn't nod off and miss Phil's, summing up of the 3 hours. I would have regretted that.
Thanks, Phil. That was